Everybody. My name's Angela Henry. I work for Rand Merchant Bank in South Africa, and I am the Business Information Security Officer.
Hi, everyone. I'm Bobby Ford, the Global Chief Information Security Officer here at Unilever. I've been enrolled now for about 2 years, and as you can tell by my accent, I am not originally from the UK, but I was born and raised in Dallas, Texas, hence all of the Dallas Cowboys football gear behind me.
Hey everyone, I'm Ed Bishop, Chief Technology Officer and co-founder of Tessian, overseeing product, engineering, and data science. I met my two co-founders studying engineering at Imperial College London, and we've been building Tessian and protecting people on email for the last 7 years.
Hello, my name is Elvis Chan. I'm a supervisory special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation here in the United States. I work in the San Francisco field office, and I have been working cybersecurity matters for about 15 years now. Before I joined the Bureau, I worked in the semiconductor industry as an engineer for about 12 years. I'm happy to be here.
Hi, I'm Ollie Bethel. I'm the Chief Technology Officer at Travers Smith, and in a secret alternate life, I was a DJ.
My name is Stefan Castriel. I'm a tech entrepreneur. Most recently, I was the CEO of Upwork. Upwork is the world's largest freelance marketplace, meaning that we help hundreds of thousands of people work from home all over the world and working with small and large companies alike. I'm really passionate about the idea of creating a better, more inclusive future of work, and remote work is a big part of that.
Hi, everybody. I'm Tim Sadler, the CEO and co-founder of Tessian, and we are building a human layer security platform to help people stay safe at work without security getting in their way.
The world's first human layer security summit.
Excellent quality speaker, a nice atmosphere of people sharing insights and knowledge.
Today, data breaches are being caused by people.
The human error is one of the key things that you can see in every single breach or incident.
I would absolutely recommend the event, yes. This is a place where you can come, where you can meet lots of good people, you can find out what's going on in the industry, and indeed understand what Tessian's doing. So I absolutely recommend it, yes.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Tessian's Human Layer Security Summit. I'm Kelly Hogan, Head of Marketing Communications at Tessian, and I'll be your host for the day. On behalf of everyone at Tessian, I want to thank you all for tuning in from across the world. We have people from London, Frankfurt, New York, San Francisco, and so many more places online with us right now. We're really happy to have you. While we wish we could all be together in person like we were at our previous summit, we're really excited that we've been able to extend the reach of this event and invite more people to participate by making it virtual. And our goal and promise remains the same, to provide you with insights from the best and brightest leaders in the industry. But before I introduce you to our incredible lineup of speakers, I want to ask you a few questions. How many of you faced cybersecurity challenges when we abruptly left our office environments and started working from our homes earlier this year? How many of you worry employees might not follow security policies now that they're no longer in close proximity to their IT teams? And how many of you feel confident that your cybersecurity strategy today will set your company up for success in the future when distributed working becomes the status quo? Today, we're addressing all of these issues with speakers from the FBI, Unilever, AWS, Investec, 451 Research, and of course, Tessian. We'll offer a range of perspectives and discuss the implications of this new world of remote working and what this means for enterprise security. Without a doubt, the coronavirus pandemic accelerated the adoption of distributed workforces for thousands of organizations, and I'm sure most of you felt that security changed seemingly overnight. But what hasn't changed is what lies at the heart of security strategy and decision-making, which is people. So now as we try to secure not one office, but a million offices, or more realistically, as many offices as we have employees, it's vital that we come together to discuss how we secure the human layer. So you can just sit back, relax, and enjoy the speakers that we have lined up, or you can get involved too. We have Q&A running throughout the event, so submit your questions by clicking on the question mark in the top left corner. If you're joining us from LinkedIn Live, there's a Q&A link in the description below. We'll do our best to get to as many questions as we can, and if we don't get to yours, we will follow up afterward. If you're sharing this event with your social networks, please use the hashtag that you see on the screen. All tweets and LinkedIn posts using the hashtag and tagging Tessian will be entered into our prize drawing to win a $100 Amazon gift card. Get your posts in by 6 p.m. Pacific time in order to have a chance to win. And last, if you experience any streaming issues, please head to the chat function in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen and someone will help you troubleshoot. So, without further ado, let's begin. I am delighted to introduce Ed Bishop, Tessian CTO, co-founder, and incidentally my neighbor tuning in from down the street. Ed will be kicking us off with our first keynote, Why Human Layer Security is Needed in Today's World. Over to you, Ed.
Thanks, Kelly, and hello, everyone. While I wish we were able to meet today in person, there are some benefits to this being a virtual event. More people from more countries are able to join, and unlike me, some of you may be sitting comfortably in your pajamas. There's always a bright side. Anyway, my name is Ed Bishop. I'm the Chief Technology Officer and co-founder of Tessian. If you've been following Tessian, you're probably familiar with human layer security and what this new paradigm means for our industry. If you're new to Tessian, welcome and thank you for joining the summit. Either way, we're all here together for the same reason, to learn something new. We've all heard, probably more times than we'd like to admit, that these are unprecedented times. Every brand that we've ever given our email address to has reminded us of this at least once. While the phrase has been overused, it is, like it or not, the truth. COVID-19 has forced most businesses to adopt remote or hybrid working structures seemingly overnight, and IT, security, and compliance leaders and their employees are up against new challenges. The perimeter has disappeared. One office has turned into thousands. We've seen a rise in email use and consequently a rise in phishing scams and data loss over email. This means that previously effective cybersecurity strategies have become obsolete overnight. This isn't a temporary change or a fleeting experiment in the way that we work. Yes, in time, life will start to resemble the way it was before. But for many businesses, this has ushered in lasting change. The most successful businesses in the future will have adopted hybrid structures that accommodate employees working from home, in satellite offices or local offices, and of course back in HQ. And it will be a win-win for businesses as it enables a more diverse, productive, and fulfilled workforce. While throughout this summit we'll be looking towards the future, I'd like to take some time to really set the stage. Where are we right now? While we've seen a spike in cyber threats in the last few months, it will probably come as no shock to anybody that the volume of cyber attacks and data breaches have been steadily increasing over the last several years. And why is this? At the heart of incidents and breaches is human error. In fact, according to Verizon's 2020 Data Breach Investigations report, errors are now more common than malware and are truly ubiquitous across all industries. What many of us don't know, though, is why things are trending like this. It's not like we haven't been trying to keep our organizations secure. In fact, every single one of our organizations will have a cybersecurity strategy for how we protect ourselves against these inbound and outbound risks. The problem is that our definition, way of thinking, and strategy for cybersecurity is out of date. The textbook definition of cybersecurity leads with the protection of networks, devices, and data. And that's exactly what we've been doing, focusing on machines and systems, but not our people. Today, it's our employees that control our most sensitive systems and data. Julia in HR controls data like employee social security numbers and compensation systems like our HR and payroll platforms. John in finance controls data like company financial accounts and banking systems like our billing platforms. Why am I telling you this? Because our organizations are only as secure as the people in it. They are the gatekeepers to these digital systems and data. Does that mean that we should blame our employees for every incident or breach we've ever experienced? Absolutely not. It means we should focus more attention on this human layer. The human layer is what keeps our business running. But what's the proverbial phrase? to err is human. And when we're talking about people, there are 3 significant security vulnerabilities. Number 1, people break the rules. They ignore security policies, they steal company data, and they don't change passwords. Number 2, people make mistakes. They accidentally leak data or accidentally misconfigure systems. And number 3, people are hacked. They can easily be tricked and coerced by attackers, especially on email. Let's take a closer look at these vulnerabilities. People break the rules. They always have, and they always will. But what does breaking the rules mean in the context of email security? It could be someone stealing customer data to sell for financial gain. It could be someone forwarding on trade secrets for a competitive edge. Whatever the method or motive, exfiltrating data via email takes only a few clicks of a mouse, and it happens more than you think. Imagine you're an employee, you're young and motivated. While you've moved up through the ranks quite quickly at your current company, you're looking for the next big thing. You need to update your resume and portfolio. You want to hold on to some of the projects that you've worked so hard on. You have no intention of selling the data or client data, the company or client data, but you want to keep what's yours. So what do? Over the course of several weeks, you email spreadsheets, presentations, contracts, and templates back to your personal email address. Harmless, right? Not quite. Those spreadsheets contain sensitive company information. Those contracts have PII of customers and clients. Those presentations contain financial projections. But this isn't a data loss incident. It's a data breach. But this is just one example. Many data exfiltration incidents aren't even malicious. More often than not, employees are just trying to do their job. For example, emailing company data to your personal email account to work over the weekend, or printing documents while working at home. While these don't sound like data exfiltration attempts, the implications are the same. Sensitive data has left the company's perimeter. It's still a breach, and this is just one of 3 human layer vulnerabilities. Let's move on to the next. People make mistakes. As we know, and I already mentioned, to err is human. But why? To start with, because we're not perfect, and that's okay. But beyond that, I can offer some insights around why people make mistakes on email. We've even done some research into the psychology of human error. And what did it reveal? It revealed that we're always on, go, go, go. We're encouraged to work fast across several devices, from our laptops to our phones to even our watches. We're distracted, especially when working from home. And because of this fast pace, a lot of us are tired. Some of us are even burnt out. So imagine it's 8:30 p.m. on a Thursday. You've had a long week, but you have to finish preparing some documents for a client. You've made a few last-minute changes, and you just need to draft the email. Your kids need to be tucked in for bed. You haven't even had a chance to eat dinner yet. You attach the files, write a quick note in the body, and type the first letter of the client's name, J. The email address automatically populates, and you click send. The problem is, the email address was incorrect. Now Jamie Douglas, a lawyer you've worked with before, has 15 pages of briefing documents for your new client that was intended for your new client, Jamie Dowd. Again, this is just one example. People are easily hacked. This quick-to-click culture we live in also influences the last human layer vulnerability that we're going to cover today. While yes, many of us are attuned to what a less sophisticated scam looks like, and probably wouldn't fall for an email from Bill Gates which offers to share his fortune. Those scams called phishing attacks are these scams called phishing attacks are evolving, and the stakes are higher than ever. Worse still, hackers tend to take advantage of key calendar moments and times of uncertainty or unrest. That's why we saw a spike in phishing attacks immediately after the outbreak of COVID, and why we've seen a surge in census scams, stimulus check scams, and US election scams over the last few months. Imagine you've been eagerly awaiting your stimulus check. Suddenly you get an email from someone that appears to work in your company's HR department. The email asks you to follow a link and answer a few questions: your name, your date of birth, your address, and some financial information. It promises that once you've entered all of the above, you'll find out how much of money you're entitled to and within a few days, it'll be transferred over. What do? Well, you probably fill in the information. In a week's time, you still haven't received a check. Meanwhile, a hacker's sold your data on the dark web. As many of you probably remember, in the 90s, it was about protecting the network, and now we have firewalls. Last decade, it was about protecting devices, and now we have EDR platforms. But now, what do we have to protect people? After all, people are an organization's most valuable asset. What options do we have to secure our employees? Some of the most common approaches are removal of access to systems, policies, training, and rule-based technologies. If we were in a theater or auditorium, I'd ask you to raise your hands if these are some of the approaches you rely on. I don't want to assume, but I'd imagine almost everyone in attendance would have their hands up. While all of these have a place in cybersecurity strategies, they alone aren't enough to prevent human error. But over the last 7 years, Tessian has been working on machine intelligence solutions specifically built to help protect our people. We've trained machine learning models on historical email datasets to learn and map out normal human relationships and behaviors in order to detect abnormalities and human error. Now, to answer the big question, what's in it for you? When you add machine intelligent technologies to your security stack, you actually have a chance to preempt incidents and empower people to make better security decisions. We call this new paradigm human layer security. Human layer security works in the background, monitoring every single email sent and received within your organization. And it turns your email data into valuable signals and insights. Remember the employee who was quietly exfiltrating data as he searched for a new job? Tessian would have flagged this behavior as suspicious, warning the user and reinforcing training and awareness policies. Tessian would also alert the security teams of the behavior, giving them full visibility of the incidents within their organization. Remember the employee who fired off an email to the wrong person late at night? Tessian would have noticed the recipient was incorrect, and after showing the employee the reasons why the email was flagged, would have asked, would you still like to send this email? Which prevents emails from ever ending up in the wrong inbox. And finally, remember the employee who fell for the stimulus check scam? Tessian would have analyzed the content of the email, including the sender and the links contained within the body. A warning message would appear, educating the user on why the email is suspicious, asking the employee if they'd like to report the near miss. Tessian helps employees make smart security decisions so that they can focus on what they do best. As the Chief Technology Officer of Tessian, I'm passionate about what happens behind the scenes of our human layer security platform. I'm both proud and confident in our technology. But what's more important than the tech behind Tessian is the impact of the technology. It started with preventing human error on email, but now it's so much more than that. We give security, IT, and compliance leaders genuine visibility into the risks within their organization. We're turning billions of data points into predictive trends. We're turning risky users into empowered, security-conscious employees. We're turning data exfiltration attempts into insights around employee satisfaction, and we're turning email attacks into actionable intelligence to consistently downtrend risk. In fewer words, we proactively prevent inbound and outbound email threats. Now that we've set the stage and you've all gotten an introduction to human layer security, let's kick off the main event. But don't forget, you can submit questions to be answered live throughout the event by clicking on the question mark button you should see in the bottom left-hand side. Thank you for joining us today. Let's get started.
Thank you, Ed. What an excellent way to set the scene. I'm going to move us swiftly on to our first panel session of the day. I'm delighted to welcome Elvis from the FBI and Bobby from Unilever. So back over to Ed, who's the host of this session.
Thank you, Kelly, for the introduction, and hello, everyone. Thanks for joining this panel, Security 360, Perspectives on Evolving Risk Profiles from Around the World. For those of you who have just joined and missed my earlier introduction, my name is Ed Bishop. I'm the Chief Technology Officer and co-founder of Tessian, and the host of this panel. For those less familiar with us, Tessian builds technology to empower people to work safely without security getting in their way. Tessian's human layer security platform automatically protects your employees on email from risks like data exfiltration, accidental data loss, and phishing. So what can you expect to learn from today's session? We'll take a quick look at how risk profiles changed overnight with COVID-19 and discuss what our panelists have observed in the transition from offices to homes and what implications this has had on cybersecurity. So I'm delighted to be joined today by Elvis Chan from the FBI and Bobby Ford from Unilever. You all bring incredible perspectives from different corners of security and data privacy worlds, so I'm really excited to bring your expertise together so we can discuss these big topics from all angles. We want to make sure this session is as valuable as possible to the security community. So I want to remind the audience that they can submit questions to our panelists through the Q&A widget at the side of the screen. So to kick us off, Elvis, do you want to briefly introduce yourself and then followed by Bobby?
All right. Thanks again for having me, Ed and Tessian. Once again, my name is Elvis Chan. I'm a supervisory special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I'm in the San Francisco field office, and I run one of our cyber squads. So as you can imagine, we've been quite busy.
Hi, everyone. I'm Bobby Ford, the Global Chief Information Security Officer for Unilever.
Great. Thank you both for the introductions. So, Elvis, I'm going to kick off with you, and it's very topical. Since the world has essentially gone into lockdown due to COVID-19, remote working has dominated the security discussion. What are the biggest risks you've observed or the FBI are observing, and how are you thinking about protecting people during this new paradigm of working?
I what we're doing right now, right? We're teleworking. I think that's top of mind for everyone. I have never heard of Zoom bombing until about 7 weeks ago, and now everyone knows about Zoom bombing. And I think the good news for everyone is that the FBI, and specifically me, I'm probably in maybe at least once a week, I'm either on the phone or in email conversations with them. And I think that's a good thing, that they welcome law enforcement involvement and talking. That's just one of the things that we're concerned with. I think even though that's what's been in the headlines, the things that concern me the most are that folks are teleworking and maybe their cybersecurity isn't fantastic. Maybe they aren't using some sort of device management system when they're logging into their corporate networks. That's like one thing in terms of corporate. And then the other thing is there's a lot of bad people out there looking to take advantage, use COVID-19 as a social engineering tactic, use it as a lure for spear phishing, for phishing, and for making fraudulent websites to either people to donate money or to actually think they're buying goods like N95 masks rather than.
Yeah, sure. And yeah, it's super interesting to both think of it, I guess, from the corporate side, how can you protect your employees, but also just the realization that this is kind of a new situation that attackers can be taking advantage of and thinking about, what techniques they're going to be using to, leverage COVID-19 to their own advantage. Bobby, I guess you are uniquely positioned here to talk about kind of the corporate angle. What do you think organizations should be prioritizing due to this, shift to work from home? It seems to be a kind of juggling act between trying to get all your employees productive, back up to speed, making sure that they have all the tools that they need to do their job. The world can't stop. Work goes on. But also you're trying to balance this against the security risks, introducing new tools, etc. How can organizations kind of navigate through this new challenge?
I think the first thing you have to do, right, is you have to recognize that overnight the threat landscape expanded exponentially. And then once you consider that, and it's not just about, enabling employees to work remotely, but it's about recognizing that overnight you basically set up, for Unilever, 70,000 offices worldwide because you sent everyone to their individual homes. And so once you sort of philosophically it's not just about deploying technical controls, but also about deploying administrative controls. And what I mean by that is you have to ensure that you secure the remote workforce, but you also have to make sure that employees are aware when they're working from home, the responsibility to create a secure environment while they work.
Yeah, it's so key. The point that you made about moving from 10 to thousands of offices overnight is absolutely critical to the conversations. And yeah, you've got to be thinking about technological, but also like it's completely changed your ops teams. Like, how do your ops teams now work in a world where everybody is in all these offices and they have all these requests? Administrative and technological solutions are very much needed. Elvis, maybe you
Right.
could go on. Sorry, yeah, Bobby.
No, I was just going to share a quick story. A buddy of mine, he's a CISO for one of the big four consultant firms, and he talked about this meeting that some of his colleagues were having, and then one of the participant in the meetings, one of their wives walked by in the background, and they were actually talking about pricing, and someone just happened to sort of send out a WhatsApp message that said, doesn't she work for, and it was one of the competitors. So it's not just about these physical, I mean, not just about these technical controls, but also about physical controls, being mindful of your environment.
Yeah, that's critical actually, and so key. It's something that I think not many people are thinking of. Most people think of their home as a safe environment. So they may be used to leaving their personal laptops unlocked. They may be used to taking personal calls wherever they like in the house. But then they're now talking about sensitive work matters. Many junior workers will be in shared homes, right? It's not even family. You're living with other people who work at different companies, and you might not know them or trust them that well. So it's kind of shifting perspectives for your employees about how they think about working securely from home. Elvis, it would be great. You mentioned this when you kicked it off about kind of attackers taking advantage of this new situation. It'd be really good if you could just give us a couple of examples of what you've seen, and particularly what the attacker maybe is trying to do to leverage this situation.
Two of the things that I really want to focus on are COVID-19 themed phishing emails. So those can come in a variety of forms. A lot of them are eliciting donations. They will have a link for you to go to a website. You click on that link, they're harvesting credentials. You go to the website and you can actually donate money to a fraudulent group, and you think you're donating money to a group in Louisiana that needs help, and you're actually donating it to a bunch of Romanian hackers. That's one thing. The other is just all of the different spoofed websites, right? So we've seen a lot of websites pretending to be the CDC or the WHO or even state and county level websites where you think you're going to get information, and then the bad guys are harvesting your information when you navigate to the website. Those are two of the things that we've been seeing.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Yeah, and we're seeing that on Tessian's end as well. Just the spike of email mentioning COVID-19. A decent portion of those are obviously legitimate. Many companies are trying to help during these times, offer advice, offer new technologies. But of course, there's the downside. There's the kind of dark side of this, which is the huge spike of COVID-19 related phishing emails, website spoofs, especially around domains. We're seeing things like, trying to take advantage of like a sense of urgency or worry. For example, we've seen attacks saying one of your colleagues has been infected. Click here to find out who they interacted with, etc. So it's really trying to play on this sense of, worry. Actually, it's a new world for everyone, and everyone's quite scared and worried, and they are trying to stay up to date with what's going on. And attackers are, of course, trying to take advantage of this. Bobby, sticking with this kind of work from home theme, I think it's very prevalent and it needs to be discussed. Tessian actually did some recent research, and we found that 48% of employees say they are less likely to follow safe data practices when working from home. Can you think, why might this be? Is it employees, trying to get away with more, or is it just that they are, maybe not set up, or they're working in new environments? Like, why are people thinking less about data security in their homes?
I think one of the challenges when you are working from home is just having this ability to remain focused. And I think that sort of when we go into the office, right, we put on our work uniform, or, we put on our work clothes, we have on our work shoes, we're in this work environment, this very professional environment, and we can be focused on the job at hand. We have a tendency when we work from home to sort of, work in shorts, to have slides on, and to be more relaxed. So it's this, I think that, like I said, this ability to remain focused. But something I do want to clarify is that I think it's important to remember that right now, this isn't typical working from home. Right. And I saw this recent post that said, recognize that we're not just working from home, but that we're working at home during a crisis. And when you throw that crisis layer on top of it, it's just hard to remain focused because you have so many things going. Because typically, if you were working from home and you had children in the house, or you had a spouse, then your spouse would be at work and the children would be at school. Right now, everyone is at home. And so you're competing with bandwidth, you're competing with priorities. So you can fully expect that guards would go down, so it's no surprise that the attack surface goes up, the attack vector goes up, that there are more attacks because the adversary recognizes that guards go down, so then attacks will go up.
That's super interesting. And I guess maybe sticking with you, Bobby, actually, on that point and double clicking on it. Yeah, work is not always top of mind, right? You've got family, you've got kids, you've got lots of distractions. You're trying to keep everything moving. You're worried about family, you're worried about friends. You're right. It's the word crisis is very important in this discussion. What can organizations do to kind of empower employees, help them understand this new world, and actually bring security into the discussion in a positive way? Not necessarily you must do this because you're now working from home, but how do you actually talk about it one that empowers them, doesn't scare them, doesn't make them feel like they're doing anything wrong, but lets them join the conversation and helps them realize why things have changed and why it might be important that they're extra diligent when working from home.
I was a philosophy major, so I'll tell you a story, and hopefully it'll give you some idea of like my approach to security. I remember when my oldest daughter was learning how to walk, and we stayed in a really small apartment. And as she was learning to walk, she would stumble and she would fall. And my responsibility as her father was to keep her safe, to keep her secure. But she would stumble and fall. But I reckon that was part of the walking, that she needed to learn how to pick herself up, that she learned how to fall, get back up. And so what I did was I would go around her and I would remove everything that was dangerous from her without her even being aware of it. Right? She was not even aware that I was protecting the environment around her. I think that as employers, we have to take that same approach. That as security professionals, we have to take that same approach. That we have to create a secure working environment without our employees even knowing it, because you have to understand that yards will go down. It's the same approach that we should take during tax season, the same approach we should take during the holiday season, just that their guards will go down, and bake that into your education and awareness program, bake that into your controls, that you can ramp those controls up, that you can ratchet those controls up, so that you're serving them and they're not even aware of it. And then just to follow up on that illustration, that one of the conversations that I kept having with a lot of my peers, in a lot of my peers in the CISO community, was, listen, we can't get in the way of these organizations as they're learning how to do this remote work. And I just saw that there were so many so many security professionals that wanted to deploy additional controls and lock everything down. And I was like, we're learning how to work from home. We're learning how to do remote work. We have to secure them without them even knowing it.
Yeah, that's it's such a good analogy about protecting kids and giving them the safe environment to kind of be themselves and not make them worried about everything. And I really like you picked up on training and awareness there as well. I think training and awareness often is discussed, I'd say mostly about inbound threats, data exfiltration, phishing emails, things coming in. But I think training and awareness in a work from home now has a whole new meaning, because it's training and awareness about things that might have been obvious when you were in the office. But now it's about reminding them, this is why locking your laptops is really important. Elvis, back over to you. I think, we're talking about very people-centric issues here. Or what Tessian describes as human layer security. I know, Elvis, you've heard us mention this phrase many times. Do companies and technology vendors need to think differently about how to protect their people, given that threat vectors now clearly always involve things like human behaviors and relationships, which maybe standard or legacy technologies maybe have had a more kind of machine layer approach? How do you start thinking about protecting people more holistically?
I appreciate your question, Ed. And I really want to just add on to what Bobby was saying. I completely agree with Bobby's philosophy on all of this. At the end of the day, even though we may be on technology 5.0, we're still on human being 1.0. And so I really liked how Bobby was focusing on the well being of the employees. And what I would like to say is instead of focusing on insider threat programs or information security programs, we should be focused on employee wellness programs. If we are caring for the well-being of our employees, then they won't be distracted. They'll be able to focus. They'll be able to take in the training. They'll be able to keep track. And they know that whatever is good for the company will be good for their well-being as well. They're going to get bigger bonuses if there aren't big employee losses from business email compromises or other things.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I love a few things that you said there about human being 1.0. I think we're gonna steal that off you, Elvis, and reuse that. And yeah, I think this kind of idea of taking it out of this security context of information security training and data protection training and shifting it into like, this is beneficial to you. This is like, we're here to help you. You're going to take these skills on and develop these skills, and they're going to get you your next job, because security is going to become more and more important, and it's something to be proud of, and it's something to engage with and adapt. I love that kind of repositioning. Bobby, I think you may be going to be, have a few ideas around this, because you've already touched on it. Kind of following on from what Elvis was saying, it's kind of a culture shift, right? It's companies who's maybe, you've maybe spent 30 years working in the IT industry, but this is a culture shift about thinking about employee wellness and kind of trying to reposition it about, how do we look after our people versus how do we, maybe put up barriers and make people dislike or distrust security teams or security products. How can organizations think culturally about how to, I'm sure many people listening are keen to hear about some techniques of how organizations can change the way that they think about security.
And this is just speaking about me. Like I said earlier, I was a philosophy major, so this is just my philosophy, and it's sort of like this approach that I've adapted, and I recognize that there are many in the industry that don't feel this way, so I get that. But unless you are in a technology company or unless you are in a cyber company, I think you have to sort of understand where you fit in the hierarchy. And for me, it's always the business first, what we're in the business to do, the business first, IT second, and then cyber third. Because I recognize that from a cyber perspective, we're to make sure that our technology, right, whether that's IT, OT, IoT, we're there to make sure that our technology and the data, that it's secure. And then the business is there. And then IT is there to enable the business. And so cyber is there to enable the business to take risk. Once you philosophically understand that approach, and again, something else that I'll say that I recognize is very controversial. Once you understand that approach, or once you take on that approach, you recognize who has the risk decision. You understand who makes the risk decision. And then it's just about security aligning to the risk decision that's been made. It's about security deploying controls that align to the business risk appetite.
Yeah, I like the way that you position that about, every organization's different. You've got to understand your risk exposure. You've got to understand who owns the risk, and you've got to understand the industry or the size of company. I think I'm probably very guilty of this, of thinking through the lens of Tessian and how we can have a security culture, but that can be very different to a 10,000 person organization, 50,000 person organization, and it's for everyone to understand that not every company is different, and you've got to figure out what security means for you and your organization. I love that. I think we're almost at time, and we have one audience Q&A, which I'm just going to pull out. And I think, Elvis, you may be well positioned to take this because you actually alluded to it in your intro section. And the question that's come from the audience is, if I paraphrase, essentially a challenging situation that they're finding as their teams are trying to enable people to work from home, but this means, evaluating and choosing technologies such as collaboration apps and video conferencing solutions more quickly than they'd like to. I guess they're being rushed into making the decision. And they've also stated that in the news, these new solutions often vulnerabilities are mentioned in the news, and you maybe go for a new piece of software and then you're reading about vulnerabilities. I think you already mentioned Zoom bombing earlier on, so I wonder if you can talk about how companies can think about assessing these platforms. Are they truly risky, or is it more about taking a pragmatic approach to get your organization up and running?
So you bring up a really good question, Ed, and I get this question a lot. At the end of the day, the Federal Bureau of Investigation can't endorse any application for teleconferencing over another. What I would say is it really depends on what you want to use it for. So if you are a teacher and you want to be doing remote learning with your kids, I think Zoom is a fine product, right? It's very easy to use. But if you want to be having more high level or proprietary discussions, you should probably be looking at some of the other applications that have better encryption, that have been shown to have more reliability and a longer track record. I think you can think of some. The FBI, even though I'm not endorsing any one product, I do want to let you know that the Federal Bureau of Investigation, we're a Microsoft shop, right? I'm on a PC right now. We have PCs at work. Typically, we use Skype for talking, and we use Microsoft Teams for teleconferencing. However, there are lots of equivalent products that are out there. And so I would tell people really kick the tires on all the different products to see what will fit your needs the best.
Perfect. Thank you for that, Elvis. Yeah, and I guess to conclude, it's about I saw Bobby nodding as well. Understanding what task you want to do, what data is being shared, what you're discussing, and just make a pragmatic approach about the right technology solution that ticks, those boxes for you. So I'm afraid that's all we have time for, but thank you to all those who submitted questions. For those that we didn't manage to cover, we'll be sure to follow up with you individually to continue the conversation. I want to say a huge thank you to Bobby and Elvis for sharing your insights with us today. I hope you'll agree it's been great to discuss some of the biggest challenges our industry has collectively faced, and I'm sure in some form or another, remote working is here to stay. And thank you to our audience for listening to this session. I'll be handing back over to Kelly, who will take us through onto the next session now, so stay tuned.
Thank you, Ed. That was fantastic. I'm so excited to introduce our next speaker. She's a true innovator, building strategic initiatives in security and emerging technologies at Amazon Web Services, as well as advising AWS's largest customers on making security a bottom line proposition. So over to Merritt Bear.
Thanks, Kelly, and hello, everyone. For those of you who have just joined and missed my earlier introductions, my name is Ed Bishop. I'm the Chief Technology Officer and co-founder of Tessian. Tessian is an AWS partner and part of the highly selective AWS APN Global Startup Program. So I'm especially pleased that we can host our next guest. I'm joined today by Merritt Bear, Principal Security Architect at Amazon Web Services. Merritt is a serious security heavyweight, and we are so lucky to have her join us. At AWS, she provides technical cloud security guidance to complex and highly regulated organizations like the Fortune 100 and advises the leadership of AWS's largest customers on how to drive security as a bottom line proposition, something we're also really passionate about. Beyond this, she's held roles in academia and 3 branches of government, so I'm really excited to hear her perspective on today's topics from all angles. So Merritt, to kick off, this feels like a bit of a turning point for security. Businesses aren't rushing back to the office, and remote working isn't really going anywhere anytime soon. At this kind of key point in change, what pre-pandemic security principles do you think are important to hold on to? And what areas do we need to start rethinking?
Hi, Ed. Thanks for having me. It's good to be here. And, I think that, to be honest, I don't see, I work at the enterprise level, so I'm not thinking about individual users and, the rise of targeted phishing campaigns, for example, or things that we're seeing at the end user level are just one piece of a broader puzzle that I look to solve. So I'm not thinking individual user level. And what I'm most concerned about when I'm talking to customers is really how do they get awareness, visibility, and the ability to execute security actions on their assets. And, it is my conviction that cloud gives you better visibility and better ability to execute on those insights. So I think to answer your question, I actually think that the principles that we had pre-pandemic are the same ones that we would apply now. And security is a process, so it's not sexy in some ways. Like there will never be a day that we say it's done. This is a human level, endeavor, and technology is human made, which always in my mind prompts the need to say, and that's why we need diverse development teams and security teams, recognizing that technology is human made. That being said, and come work for us or for Tessian. I mean, like this is my point where I give a little plug to folks who feel like they don't fit in the ecosystem to come, because we need folks who think they don't fit. But that being said, so the principles that we had before, I think, are still relevant. We're thinking through things like defense in depth, thinking through the life cycle of your security management, thinking through how to automate more. And also thinking through some of the kind of higher order things that you're able to do with cloud. So one of my favorite teams at AWS, for example, is the automated reasoning team. And they do, our automated reasoning group is, they do formal methods and higher level math applied to computer reasoning. So now that infrastructure is code, you can take something like a CloudFormation template or Terraform or whatever, you can deploy that, and you have, physical assets spun up, and now you can do security as code. So you're looking at your security groups, you're looking at network access control lists, and the traditional perimeter-based model is not where the security conversation ends these days. So automated reasoning group actually applies that new reality to and allows you to use higher level math. So we use it internally to verify that our boot code is correct, to verify our crypto protocols, and we have it in external customer-facing products in, for example, Zelkova, which compares identity and access management, IAM policies, to see which one is more permissive, and in a tool called Tiros, which is now part of Amazon Inspector, that without a single packet going over your network can tell you about network reachability. So things like whether you have an internet-facing endpoint. So these are, there are ways that you can get at the kind of transcendental side of security as code. But I think, there's no replacement for some of the basic blocking and tackling that we'll always have to do.
Perfect. Thank you so much for sharing that. And also, I would like to echo Merritt's comments about if you feel like you care about security and want to get stuck in and don't feel like you're maybe welcome or feel like an outsider. Yeah, Amazon and Tessian would love to have you. So reach out to us. So Merritt, picking up on that, I think it's really interesting that you mentioned that actually cloud, viewing cloud through, viewing security through cloud, if you've made that adoption, not too much has changed actually with the shift to kind of remote work. I guess it would be really interesting to hear your insights of, I imagine many of the CISOs watching today maybe aren't using AWS, they're maybe not using other cloud providers, and they don't necessarily think of that as kind of security for them. They're thinking still on-prem models. Many enterprises are making the shift. And I'm really interested in, when does automation come in that part, kind of that timeline? So an enterprise comes to AWS and works with people like yourselves to start thinking about security. How comfortable are enterprises to start adopting things like automation? You mentioned things like security as code, something we're also really excited about at Tessian. But where does that come on the journey? Does it come straight away, or is there kind of a period of time where they need to get up to speed with AWS? It's a huge transformational shift for them, and maybe the automation comes slightly later. I'd just love to hear how you talk to your clients about that kind of when to bring in automation and things like security as code.
Yeah, so you are right in that, this tipping point, although it's really significant in our lives as humans, actually I think suits cloud in a lot of ways, because we know that cloud gives customers or whatever users the freedom to spin up and down, to be real adopters of agile instead of waterfall development methodologies, by which I mean instead of 6 or 9 or 12-month cycles that developers are working against, you've got short sprints and you can continuously reevaluate and spin assets up and down when you're in cloud. And that freedom, I think, is what really drives the move to cloud. That being said, no one would do anything if they didn't think it could be secure. And I do hear increasingly that security is a reason to move. And I think that's fair. I think that's an accurate representation to say that it can and should be a driver. But I guess I want to kind of give a nod to the fact that there, a real motivator for most enterprises is that generative side. It's the business that they're in. So if you're talking to a retailer or a healthcare organization or an oil and gas organization or whatever, the ability to go after their own bottom line, to suit their own customers, and to prioritize their own IT and billing and everything management is really a key benefit of moving to cloud. In terms of the move to automation, so I really think that this is an inherently cloudy thing. So I don't think that it is something that waits for you when you reach some, Super Mario Brothers level and you get to eat the coin or whatever. I think you will see benefits on day one in the form, especially, as you mentioned, for every enterprise, it's a little bit of a different journey. But a lot of folks have some on-prem assets, and that's fine. That doesn't take away from the benefits that you get for the stuff that you are moving. And I think that what we see is, some customers are really looking to manage services because that allows them to take advantage of more of a curated experience when they go into the cloud. So these are ones that kind of include some default reckoning on our side and sort of lead that shared security model. So where Amazon takes care of the security of the cloud and the customer generally is responsible for security in the cloud, managed services give you a more high touch model where we are providing some kind of default reckoning in there. And so some customers find that helpful to get into more automation. But you can also just build your own architectures, as custom as you want. And I think the short answer, I hear myself saying that even though I've been talking for a few minutes, but the short answer is automation is available to you as a benefit from day one. But I think, more sophisticated customers get better at it. And the way that they do that is by being even more conscious and coherent about their strategy around the assets they have. So things like tag-based approaches to their knowing what assets you have and tagging them. You can tag based on compliance regimes. You can tag based on, development teams and who owns what, or cost centers. But that's just one example of a way that sophisticated organizations are really proactive about knowing what they have, and then once you have that architecture in place for tagging, for example, you can take remediative actions that are based on that. So really getting to the point where you leverage that freedom to kind of automate yourself out of a job. Our SOC, our Security Operations Center, is really minimal. It's like a guy with a cell phone. And that is just because we have scripted, we have a personal, I'm referring to companies as people, being a Scalia here. So our internal policy is that you don't close a trouble ticket until you've scripted the remediation. So, that leads to, in small ways, that's one way to kind of create this culture of automation.
That's it's super interesting to hear you talk about automation being available. I guess from day one, but maybe it's maybe not every company wants to do it straight away. And I mean, I believe it's a very cloud principle. I don't think many companies that are still pretty much full on-prem, think too much about automation, but, I'm excited for them to go on that journey because, it's super interesting when you start going deeper and thinking about how you can grow a company without your security operations team growing with the number of employees. It's just kind of unprecedented leverage that you can get. I'd love to hear you've mentioned this already, security being a very human problem. After all, we are at the Human Layer Security Summit. One of the things that Tessian really cares deeply about is understanding, human error. It's inevitable. We can't train people to be right 100% of the time. And with the kind of unprecedented options that a platform like AWS gives to IT and security professionals, I think one of the common fears that we hear from our customers is we're one configuration away from accidentally making an entire S3 bucket public. I'd love to hear how internally AWS think about human error with configuration, and I can, as a huge AWS fan and customer, there are lots of configuration options, and that's what makes it so powerful. But how does AWS internally think about the fact that people will make mistakes? How do you build that into your product? How do you build that into your own internal kind of monitoring, etc.? Just love to hear a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I think that our approach is to try to make the secure thing to do the easiest thing to do. And that takes work on the engineering side. It takes work on the human level policies side. And it ultimately recognizes that we are human, and we try to put in, fail safes, and also to kind of help customers to understand, the right tool for the right job. So I think that our approach internally is actually very open. We allow developers to really run, but of course, depending on your industry and your risk profile, I think it would make sense for different customers to choose different approaches. That being said, I've seen customers do things like have alarming where assets that are out of compliance, they get alarmed, and in 15 minutes they bring them down. And pretty soon you'll get developers knocking on your security team's door, and that's fine. Then they have a conversation about what security policies are in place and what would make them acceptable. So I think that there's no one answer here either, but the process itself is driven by a mix of technical controls, human layer policies, and then ultimately, figuring out what works in execution, being wise about production and test environments too is one way to ensure that, things shouldn't go into production until you've done a fair amount of testing.
Yeah, perfect. No, makes a lot of sense. A lot of how you think about it is relatively similar to how we think about it. So it's good to see that there's some overlap there. You mentioned, just to pick up on one of those phrases about, developers knocking on the door, something we, have been hearing about now for a good number of years. Again, something that we're pretty passionate about as a company is this concept of, shifting security left. You can't view your security team now as the 20, 30, 100 people in the security operations center, like with AWS and the amazing tooling and the agile, you've already mentioned waterfall to agile and what AWS can do for development teams. How important is it now for your the developers on your team to be viewed as security professionals? How can AWS empower developers to understand, the power that's been wielded with, the AWS platform? And how are you at AWS thinking about that? Is that something you believe in? Is it something you're a proponent of and an advocate for? Just love to hear your thoughts on, shifting security left.
Yeah, definitely. I think, this is something that is near and dear to me personally, where I sometimes ask folks who are developers to take a look at something and just kind of put a security eye on. So it is because I believe that there is nothing that inherently makes a person a security person except the sort of consciousness to look at the world that way. And by the same token, I used to say, walking around, I don't remember what it was like to see the world before I was a security person. And I think but that is actually in my view, a healthy thing for organizations to really embed security into everything they do. At Amazon, we use the phrase security is job zero, which just connotes the idea that like you don't get to tack it on after the fact. It is not an afterthought, and it's not a a late arrival in a perimeter thing where you bolt it on. But the the reality, I think, for developers is also changing. Like the old perimeter-based model just doesn't work. You need to be building with an awareness of security as you go. And what I've seen at AWS is that developers don't always feel like they are security people, but they often are. Like that this is, again, just a perception. And to be fair, the security community can be kind of a snarky place. And so I think a lot of folks avoid it because it can be intimidating and a little bit of a know-it-all kind of culture. But that too is, in my mind, not good enough. If your developers are not understanding, the decision-making or even just the kind of reasoning that went into some of your security decisions, then you need to help them understand. And certainly the way that we are building in cloud is with security as part of the way that you make architectural decisions. So there is no way to, silo that and exempt your developers from needing that kind of awareness.
Yeah, no, and I completely echo your thing about it being a perception challenge. I think when you go to developer meetups and you talk to the developer community, they won't necessarily call themselves, part of security is a main part of their job, but when you actually go into how they think and what they do day to day, of course security is part of their job. It's kind of on the first release checkbox or planning document is security considerations. It's just a perception thing, and I think hopefully over time companies like Amazon, Tessian can kind of change that perception so that it's something to be proud of. People engage with. They don't try and pretend that they're not doing it and they're not part of the security community. Those worlds are just going to keep merging. I believe. I guess
I agree. I think.
Sorry.
So for anyone who's watching, if you want to talk about security, feel free to also send me a note or tweet at me. I will just put that out there now. I'm happy to talk to folks who are interested in kind of shifting more to security in their roles. And I also think that this is one of those conversations that folks should proactively engage their executive leadership with and make sure they get buy-in ahead of time. The time to make your executives invest in your security team is not when something has gone wrong. The time is all, is in that early drumbeat kind of conversation where you say, these are the kinds of things that we care about and the kinds of automations we're putting in play and the kinds of, restrictions we're going to set because it's the right thing for our risk profile, and get buy-in from your executives and make escalations part of your culture. So for example, at our in our response regime, we have automated escalations, and so senior folks know that they need to answer the phone for security, and that is just an expectation. It doesn't matter whose fault it is just the way that we do business. And I think if you want to ensure that folks are getting the important messages that you need them to get from a security perspective, creating that as a cultural expectation ahead of time is a really important element.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. And you should definitely take Merit up on that offer to answer a couple of tweets if you're interested in security. I think we probably have time for one more topic, and I know it's something that you're particularly interested in, Merit, and it's around zero trust. It's another thing that we are hearing more and more about over the last couple of years. It's also something our audience is really keen on hearing about. I've seen a number of questions come in about zero trust. Could you just talk a little bit about zero trust? Why does it matter? Why are we hearing about it more and more? Does the kind of changing in remote working and, you've already mentioned like the perimeter is broken, the perimeter is no more. I think remote working has probably, has destroyed the perimeter even more than before. So I'd love to hear just about, your thoughts on zero trust, what it means in a perimeterless world, what it means for remote working, etc. Yeah, just love to hear some thoughts on that.
Sure. So, to my mind, zero trust is, as you mentioned, kind of a hot topic, but this isn't a new concept. I think that the way that I think of it is the benefits that you get from Amazon and the fact that we have, for example, custom hardware, the AWS Nitro system, that has a ton of security benefits, the benefits that you get from everything that we kind of do on the customer side or on our side on behalf of customers. And then there is the zero trust that is like what customers can be doing to enforce that and to use the building blocks of AWS to create an environment that feels zero trust. The common sense part of me says, not every decision should be as laden with security protocols as possible, right? I mean, like, not every simple phone interaction needs the same type of security as as classified interactions would, or so some of this is just a determination of where your crown jewels are and how to making sure that you have an awareness of what you kind of want to tolerate around the security and accessibility of what you have. But I would say that, the conception with zero trust is just like you mentioned, that you can look at traditional network perimeters, but that's not where the conversation ends. We need to be thinking about the ways that you implement your security controls throughout the process. And, these days that looks like everything as you architecturally make decisions. So the ways that you have your identity and access management set up, and hopefully least privilege enforced all over. And then also, the ways that you have configured your assets to be distrustful inherently, let's say. So I think that, like I said, this is not a new concept, but it has taken on new life recently. And I actually think that it makes sense in cloud to take advantage of the fact that you don't have to maintain those bottom layers of the stack. The basic proposition of cloud is that from the concrete floor up through layer 4, the hypervisor, we protect those. And so that in itself, gives you returns on investment, especially if you're a small or medium business. But even the largest folks, we've got Netflix and Airbnb and Pinterest, running fully on AWS. These are folks with a lot of interesting security considerations, and they're doing it in the cloud.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. And yeah, I completely agree about, having to have a pragmatic approach. Not everything needs to be, completely slowed down by the most stringent security checklists. It's about understanding, like you said, where the crown jewels are, where's your most sensitive data and assets, and making sure that the right security procedures are based around those things. And let's empower people to go and do their jobs and not burden them and slow them down in areas where it's not so relevant. I think that
Ed, you're not disagreeing with me at all, and
sorry for that.
You're keeping it.
Yeah, it's very I mean, we're very aligned, so we're very security first. So yeah, I think that is all we've got time for, actually. And thank you to all of those who have submitted questions. And for those that we didn't answer, we will be sure to follow up with you individually. I'd love to obviously say a huge thanks for Merit and spending time with us and sharing her insight today. And thank you to the audience for joining the session. I'll be handing back over now to Kelly, who will take us onto the next session, and we'll be unveiling some incredibly exciting news. So stay put.
Thanks, Harry and Shanti, and welcome to the customer panel on what does a future-proofed human layer security strategy look like. I'm Henry, and I head up our customer success team here at Tessian. It's so exciting to see that we are finally announcing our human layer security intelligence platform to the world. I'm very lucky in the sense I have the privilege of working with customers to mitigate these types of risks every day. And I know the huge impact that the ability to get better insights and automated intelligence is going to have. And we're also very lucky to have some of those customers joining me today to discuss the impact of remote working on their cybersecurity strategies. Each of our panelists bring a different perspective from the security and data privacy world. So we'll be coming at things from all angles today, and hopefully we'll cover all bases. So let's kick off with some really brief introductions. Clive, do you want to kick us off by introducing yourself, and then let's go to Angela and then on to Ollie?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Clive Novus. I'm the Chief IT Risk Officer of Investec.
Hi, everybody. I'm Angela Henry, and I'm the Business Information Security Officer at Rand Merchant Bank in South Africa.
And hello, I'm Ollie Bethel. I'm the Chief Technology Officer at Travers Smith.
Great. Thanks for that, guys. So to kick us off, with so many of us transitioning over to a remote working environment almost overnight, a huge amount of agility and reprioritization has been required from technology and security leaders to keep up with the changing environments that we find ourselves in. One of the first challenges that we're certainly seeing is understanding how this change affects and impacts the people in your organizations. I'd love to understand how each of you have learned, what each of you have learned about how people behave and how they handle data differently to when they're working at home. So perhaps, Angela, if we could start with you and then on to Ollie and then on to Clive.
So what we're finding is that people are sending mails to non-work related mail accounts because obviously we have some restrictions in place on work machines. So that has impacted how they're able to print, etc. at home. So they're sending their files to Gmail, etc. to be able to then circumvent the controls we have.
That's really interesting. Do you think that it's because the attitudes are becoming more relaxed, or it's more that, needs must and they need to access this data and therefore that's the only way they can do that?
I think people need to get their work done and they will find a way to work around the controls if it doesn't work for them.
Yeah, absolutely. Ollie, I'd love to understand your perspectives. How's it changed things for your lawyers at Travers?
That challenge that Angela talked about is something that historically we've had to deal with in law firms where we've always been biased towards security over productivity. And in these scenarios, I think we then discover that actually what we're doing is creating a sort of a backdoor route to potential data loss. Actually using the Tessian tools, we've been able to identify if anyone were to try to send attachments to webmails, they had to put a justification in for that. And then if that justification doesn't meet our policy, we have a conversation with them to understand what their intention is and see whether we need to make any changes. We invested quite heavily last year to really improve ease of working for agile working, not really with this particular scenario in mind of a pandemic, but certainly the ability for people to work where they need to. So we've managed to resolve a number of the challenges that were preventing people from working that way. I think as people have gone into lockdown, what we're finding from the sort of information security perspective is actually for people that are maybe working in shared flats or shared houses, they're finding that being able to have confidential conversations can sometimes be difficult, and so they're finding quite interesting ways to make sure that they stay private. So we kind of assume that everybody's got an easy place to work, but actually I think the pandemic is proving that people are finding it a little bit uncomfortable, and so we're trying to give them the tools to be able to work where they need to.
Yeah, it's such an interesting point because when you when you think about it, it's not only are you catering just for a remote workforce in terms of everyone just working at their desk at home, but it's like every single person's individual circumstances and then how that plays to like the data security policies and priorities that you have in place. So it's you're constantly adapting your policy to ensure that it suits everyone in their like individual working circumstances. Clive, over to you. How about at Investec? Have you sensed a change in attitudes? Have you seen any kind of behaviors that you hadn't seen previously in terms of how people handle data or act in relation to security?
Yeah, I think a little bit of a combination between Angela and Ollie has been our experience. So firstly, we were we enabled a remote workforce long before COVID hit. So everyone had laptops, everyone had VPN technology. So people were always able to work from wherever. So our security tools, including Tessian, didn't really need to change all that much as a result of COVID, because we enabled that already. We found that our users are very much well-intentioned. So, what Angela was saying in terms of they want to do work, they want to access the files. But there were some limitations in terms of, needing to physically print paper and then sign it, for example. So we had to change some of the ways in which those business processes work and roll out different technologies in order to have, wet signatures. In terms of people's behavior, again, we had a lot of queries around, can I do this? Can't I do this? Am I allowed to send this home? Can't I send this home? Or how do I send this home securely? So we've had to get on the front foot in terms of, educating our users in how to use the tools which were in place already. But, so far we've seen, very positive response from our user base towards some of the security tools which we have in place. And as I say, they're well-intentioned, and they want to do the right thing. We just need to be able to enable them.
Yeah, and I think that's such a huge thing, isn't it? Is like making sure you're enabling them to be able to work. As Ollie said, having that bias towards productivity. It is not feasible to lock everyone down and say, oh, just now because you're working at home, controls need to get even tighter. In many ways, we need to understand the pressures that people are under and make their lives even easier at work. But hopefully, augmenting them with awareness and technology to help them do so. Ollie, you mentioned a little bit about the justifications that you use within the Tessian platform to get good visibility of risks, and that's kind of an area I wanted to go down next, which is understanding the visibility of the risks that you have across your organization. And it's something that I think is often unintentionally underplayed. We recently did a DLP survey, and it showed that email risks are 38 times more likely than IT leaders predict, which is a pretty astonishing fact. With users now being in home offices all across the world and different parts of the country, etc., how do you ensure, Ollie, at Travers, that you have insight into the developing threats and trends that you may hear more anecdotally when you're in the office?
So for us, it's all about education. And I think this is really at the forefront of what Tessian approaches, which is ultimately it's our people that are probably the biggest risk, but they're also the ones that are personally responsible. And I think everybody at Travers recognizes that and takes personal responsibility for maintaining security. So we have a big education program. We run constant phishing exercises where we internally phish our own people with targeted emails based on current events, and then we track the behavior to see what the response is like. Interestingly, we've seen a little bit of a tick up in terms of the clicks as we've gone into lockdown. I think that's probably as a result of people working in different conditions. Although people are going to be at their desk all day, I think the boundaries between work and home are blurred a bit. So people are taking their personal devices, their personal mobile with them, or their work phone, and then maybe having a quick scroll on emails while they're distracted and can quite easily click on something, particularly if it's highly targeted to some of the things that are going on in the world at the moment. What has been quite positive to see is people making much more use of the Tessian report and delete button within Outlook. So we can see that although there is an increase in the clicking, actually it's being exceeded by an increase in the amount of reporting that's going on. So I think for us, it's really just been interesting to see perhaps people are a bit more distracted as we've gone into lockdown. We're just trying to reinforce through education as much as we can.
Yeah, absolutely. And in terms of education, and Angela, I'd love to hear your perspectives on this. In terms of education, often when we think about mitigating these security risks, as Ollie just touched on, one of the first steps to effective mitigation is awareness and making sure that users are aware of the sophistication and also the presence of the risks to effectively drive preventative behaviors. Do you think that awareness is harder to create when someone it's the informality, right, of being at home, and it's the informality of like you're sat on the sofa and as Ollie said, or you may be at lunch and you're just sort of looking at your phone. Do you think people are engaging as much in like awareness and training around security in a remote working environment, or do you see challenges there?
So I do see challenges. Obviously, when you're in the office, it's a controlled environment. You can target specific awareness and training campaigns. At home, it's a little bit more difficult. But I think what we've tried to do is we've tried to engage with a more personal kind of link to it. So bringing it back to how to keep you and your family safe, linked into your data as well as the company data. Then you find that people are more willing to, the controls are more palatable if they can actually understand the reason why.
Completely agree. And I think it also just shows a real human touch that's so important for people to engage in something that is like ultimately, they're the best judge of whether those emails coming in are the right emails or the wrong emails in terms of whether they should be responding, and resonating with them in that way is just such an important element. Clive, to touch back a little bit on visibility of risks, and I was speaking to a CISO the other day who gave me really interesting insight, saying that this new world that we live in terms of remote working and all of the pressures that our users face on a day-to-day basis, it's really challenged what priorities people should be thinking about and what risks are the risks that we should be tackling in the near term. Angela there just touched on a few, and Ollie in fact touched on a few COVID-specific risks, for example, like spear phishing. I'd love to understand how you think about identifying those newer threats that you see within your user base, and then how you decide whether you focus time and efforts on those risks in the near term, or whether they just go, as part of a risk register and something to solve for later.
Yeah, so risk identification, or scanning the world in terms of what's really happening, comes from many different sources. So firstly, we have a threat intel function with threat intel feeds from some of the big vendors. So that's one source in terms of what's going on and what are the new threats which working from home and COVID has thrown at us, really. The second one is talking to great people like yourselves and the good people at Tessian, but also the other CISOs and information security officers and tech risk managers around the globe, which we're members of various forums. So we share a lot of information, we talk to each other, and we come up with sort of common themes which everyone is facing. And then we take those back to our organizations. And then the last one is actually looking at what's happening with our user base. Are we seeing changes in behavior? So we have UBA technology, which is rolled out across all of our laptops. We also look at things like some of the Tessian reports to understand the changes in our user behavior. So we get a lot of information from a lot of different people, and then we bring that back and we have information security forums and prioritization sessions, and we say, look, this is what A, B, and C are seeing, or these are the changes in behavior. Is it worth investigating this further? Is it worth investment? Is it worth enhancing the controls? And we have a prioritization session together with our CIO and our CISO and other key stakeholders, like people from operational risk or internal audit.
And do you think that the kind of like business involvement in those committees and I guess like executive, like non-security executive involvement in security risks, do you think the emphasis has changed at all with in a remote working environment where there's more emphasis towards making sure that we're focusing on those risks which are particularly prevalent with remote working? Or kind of, are you already on top of that? Because it seems like, everyone on this call were, pretty ahead of the curve in terms of having remote working set up before this pandemic hit.
Yeah, I mean, business engagement is key, right? Because ultimately we're trying to enable a remote workforce in a secure way. So, we've certainly almost stepped up our engagement with key business stakeholders to make sure that their users are able to function. Like a silly example is there are some signatures which actually have to be done in in ink. So we've sent we've sent printers to people's houses, but we've also sent shredders to people's houses to make sure that once the document is signed and scanned, then it can be destroyed in a secure way. So certainly we've had to engage our business leaders to make sure that the workforce is operating in a secure manner.
Yeah, I really like that. A very relevant response to kind of like the pressures that you don't necessarily think about in the office. I certainly don't have a shredder at home. So it'd be difficult if I had to get rid of a document, or a lot of cutting paper with scissors probably. It's likely that we're never going to return to a lot of people are talking about how this changes the work environment for good. Yes, I'm sure we'll all return to the office in the near future, but probably in a very different capacity. And with that, security strategies are inevitably going to develop and change and evolve with the different working practices that we have. The way that we see it, and we speak about quite a lot at Tessian, is that security used to be a lot about securing the network or devices that your users operate within or on, but now it's a lot more complex. Ollie, I'd love to understand to what extent that you think we now need to turn our focus to the people that we're trying to protect and really double down on this human layer security element of protecting users.
Yeah, so I think, as mentioned in the previous question, for us it's about education. But the other element of it is really understanding how our people need to work in order to meet the expectations of our clients. So one of the things that we've seen, like I'm pretty sure every business, as we've gone into lockdown, there's been this huge push towards the big web conferencing platforms. So initially that was Zoom, and I think in recent weeks that started to become Teams. So one of the advantages for us from a technology perspective is that means that we've been able to roll out software that previously would have taken months with lots of very hands-on training. We've been able to just do it in a matter of days with just a launch email. And actually, it's been fantastic to see people just grab hold of it because they know that's what needs to be used in order to deliver the service that's expected. But with that, people are going to need constant support because the tools are changing very quickly. We've seen with Zoom and Microsoft's release cadence that new features are being added all of the time. And a lot of stuff has been in the news around Zoom, for example, how easy it is to accidentally leave your Zoom meeting insecure. So we're having to just reinforce training all of the time. Instead of it being in the sort of traditional training programs that we might have used, we have daily updates. We're just providing updates at every opportunity within team meetings because the software is just changing all of the time, and our people are having to adjust and get used to that really, really quickly. So that's probably been the biggest challenge for us, but also a great opportunity as well.
Do you see users in turn engaging a lot more in terms of you mentioned that training can be cut down to like very different ways that you were doing previously. Do you see getting users really like embracing that new technology now because they know how much it's going to help them, whereas previously they could perhaps avoid it being in the office?
Yes. So we went from, because Travis Smith has one office in London and also an office in Paris, but most of the population are within London. So much of the internal communication is done face to face, which means that the need for tools like Slack or Teams hasn't been as much demand as perhaps in other organisations. That means that we've just made use of Skype for Business for the past few years, and since we went into lockdown, the usage of that for web meetings obviously just skyrocketed. Very quickly, people started to realize they wanted to do different things. They were getting experience of using Teams or Zoom and working with clients or other third parties. So they've suddenly been pushing us saying, we want these new tools, we want these new tools. And that's great for us because actually the adoption push-pull has really shifted. So our focus now is just trying to keep up with the demand rather than having to push new technology onto people. So it's a great opportunity, but obviously we need to make sure that we do it carefully and safely as much as possible and don't rush to push technology out until we're really confident we've secured it in the right way.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's a great catalyst for change in many respects. Angela, hitting on something that you mentioned earlier, which really resonated, which was it's about educating your employees and making them understand how these security risks and these new working environments can affect them. And I think that one thing that we've certainly been reflecting on at Tessian, and one of our values is human first, is recognizing that it's a really stressful time for everyone, right? Like there's a lot of changes both inside work but also outside work, which some of which are really overwhelming. How do you guys find like balancing delivering a risk mitigation approach, but with also not overburdening your employees, that they have all of these security obligations and they have to work securely 100% of the time? And how do you communicate that effectively to users?
So I think what we've tried to do is, where possible, we've put some technology in place to mitigate the risk where possible, and then we've tried to educate. But it's very difficult because you have to try and understand. Certainly in SA, we've been in lockdown, I think it's 71 odd days.
Wow.
And yeah. And it's been very stressful because everybody's home environment is different, and our schools have been closed for 71 odd days. So you've got somebody at home who's trying to be a teacher to their children, as well as try to do their work at their normal day job. And then they have, in SA, data is pretty expensive. So we've got all of those, and connectivity is not great. And we've got all the other infrastructure type challenges, and to try to understand the human aspect as to what anxiety and stress that individual has got, because everybody's is going to be different, and try to make it as easy as possible for them to comply and to work securely. And again, if you relate it back to their personal environment, everybody wants their children in their home to be safe. So we've tried to use that angle in terms of awareness and education.
Yeah, no, it's such a good point. And I think that I feel like I know my co-workers and customers in a more intimate way than ever before, because you do get kids coming on the screen, or a dog walking past, or our CFO always has a cat walking across her desk, and it's really important that we understand and kind of let that element of people's personal lives come into both our relationships at work, but also how we think about protecting them, because that's how we can really focus on them first. Clive, I'd love to understand, taking that a little bit further and understanding, the challenge of trying to protect users across many different jurisdictions and geographies. How do you balance the world is reacting at very different paces to what's going on at the moment across the world? How do you balance a consistent approach across, the entirety of your user base, or do you take sort of more of a piecemeal approach? And yeah, I'd love to understand a little bit about that.
So it comes from the top. So we've got fantastic support both from our obviously CIO, but more importantly from the CEO. So the tone is set from the top in terms of the security culture and being able to make sure that the controls are effective, but not only that, is that the controls are consistent across the globe. So we've standardized on, as I was saying, one laptop build with one set of technology, with one set of, teams supporting that technology. So we've been able to do that with the support of the execs, really. It's got to come from the top, else you get into these discussions. Australia want to do it one way, and New York want to do it another way, and then Ireland want to do it this, and and then you get into a mess, and then you're obviously only as strong as your weakest link. So we've taken the approach to standardize our security controls across the group, roll out technology like Tessian, for example, on everyone's laptop, and as I say, that support comes from the top.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, using technology to get feedback and understand what your user base is doing in a really scalable way is something that we're really passionate about. And also making sure that, when you're presenting your users with the opportunity to give that feedback, it's in relation to really relevant security events that have happened to them, because it really resonates with them and they understand the relevance. really interesting insight. Thanks for that, guys. I'm going to move on to a question that we've had that's come in from the audience. So how do you create a strong security first presence when your employees are no longer in the office? And I think this goes back to a little bit about what we were talking about earlier, is the formality of going into the office can sometimes give you can like put you in the mindset that actually, you're going into the office and you go through those controls and, you have to work and act in a certain way. Ollie, I'd love to understand like how you've tried to do that and like kind of double down on security. You mentioned a little bit about like release cycles and how you manage new technology going out, but are there anything else that you've drawn on to help you do that?
I think there's probably two main things. One is we really try to introduce tools that are easy to use. So if a tool is easy to use, then generally it becomes the default way that something is done. And therefore it's the secure way that it's done. Just the example that Clive used around wet ink signatures, we've moved and transitioned very quickly to using e-signature technology because that's the easiest and the quickest way to get the deal done. And that's, I think, will start to become the default. And obviously that has the security built into it. The other part of it is, back to that education point, we just bake in security when we talk about security in all of the comms that go out. So as we started to go into lockdown, we just really reinforced the point on people making sure that they had everything that they needed. They could use the tools that they needed. They wouldn't have to use any other systems in order to continue to deliver client service. As we think about a potential return to the office and kind of get used to this new normal, it's just a continuation of that. So it's that constant education. It's making sure that people look out for any malicious emails. They're being mindful when they are sending anything out. Obviously, the Tessian tools are incredibly powerful in helping to protect us from ourselves, but we do really reinforce that ultimately the responsibility lies with the individual, and we can't rely on technology alone.
Yeah, no, really, really interesting insight, Ollie. And as a former lawyer myself, I'm very pleased to hear that lawyers are now using e-signatures and those technologies to make. Yeah, exactly. And this is what I mean, right? In many ways, we've like catapulted probably like 5 years in terms of adoption of some of these technologies, and I think hopefully that's going to be a real change for the good across technology.
It's just an accelerant. It's just an accelerant, isn't it? So it's all the stuff that actually once people try it, it works, and it works really well, then I think it will become the default. So electronic signatures, a lot of video conferencing, those kind of tools, I think will start to become the default for how work is done.
And I think what really resonates with me there as well is what you mentioned about if you can introduce a bit of technology that is almost so frictionless that people see the immediacy of like the benefit that it has to them, then you're onto a winner because they come back to you and ask for more. Every time you introduce something which sort of slows them down or impedes productivity, then you're kind of like having to fight the battle next time, because that's like the assumption that may be the next impact. Yeah. I'm afraid we've run out of time. Thank you so much, all of you, for all of the amazing insight into what is a pretty bizarre time and pretty challenging roles that you all have. Really appreciate you taking time out of your days to share the different perspectives from all different angles. And a huge thank you to our audience for not only joining the session, but also asking some great questions. And sorry we didn't get time to tackle some more. That's all we have time for now. I'm going to hand back over to Kelly, who will take us on to the next session.
How many of you are feeling the pain and limitations of DLP with the move to remote working? Data loss on email has taken on a new urgency as email use has increased significantly during lockdown. We decided to get to the heart of these issues in our new piece of research, the State of DLP 2020. Tim Sadler, Tessian CEO and co-founder, will be taking you through the research and showing you how it can help you drive your own DLP strategies in a remote world.
Thank you, Kelly, for the introduction, and a big welcome again to everyone who's joined us for our Human Layer Security Summit. I'm Tim Sadler, CEO and co-founder at Tessian, and I'm really excited to bring you our latest research today. Data loss on email is not a new challenge by any means, but it's taken on a new urgency with our global shift to remote working. Across our customer base, we've tracked huge spikes in data exfiltration incidents since this shift, and so we simply can't ignore the impact that it's having on data security. And as a few of our speakers have already mentioned today, remote working is here to stay in one form or another, so it's an area of data protection we really need to get right. We decided to get straight to the heart of this issue in our report, The State of Data Loss Prevention 2020. We analyzed Tessian platform data, surveyed 2,000 end users and 250 IT leaders across the UK and the US, as well as interviewing industry leaders across IT, security, compliance about their own experiences with DLP. And so today we're bringing this research to you to help you drive your own DLP strategies and to thrive in this new world of work. At a high level, I'll be covering why DLP is a growing problem before looking at how effective current solutions really are. We'll finish by looking at the next generation DLP strategy you can deploy in part 3. But crucially, from this data, you'll walk away with visibility into the frequency of data loss incidents on email, which are happening as much as 38 times more than IT leaders currently estimate. An understanding of why DLP is even more challenging when workforces are remote, and insight into why security awareness training, policies and procedures, and rule-based solutions alone aren't enough to prevent data loss. So to kick off, we need to understand why DLP is such a growing problem. So I'll ask the audience this: when I say DLP, what do you immediately think of? What ecosystem are you trying to protect? Our data tells us that email is the #1 threat vector, with nearly half of IT leaders surveyed saying email is the threat vector they're concerned most about protecting. And it makes sense, right? Email threats from insiders are steadily rising, with a 47% increase in incidents, including accidental data loss and deliberate data exfiltration over the last 2 years. But it's not only about the ecosystem. The risk is rooted in the fact that it's your people who control your business's most sensitive systems and data. Whether it's someone in your finance department who oversees billing and banking platforms, someone in your HR department who controls employee social security numbers and compensation plans, or someone in a client-facing role handling customer data. They are the gatekeepers of digital systems and data. But what do we know about people? We know that they break the rules and they make mistakes, and the data reveals that they're even more likely to do so when working from home. We all know by now there are new challenges around remote working. As workforces have transitioned from office to home, IT leaders are struggling to maintain visibility over data flow. So if you've been wrestling with new risks to data loss, you're not alone. In fact, 84% of IT leaders report DLP is more challenging when their workforce is working remotely. And why shouldn't it be more challenging? The perimeter has quite literally disappeared as organizations have made the sudden shift to 1 or 2 offices to potentially thousands. This means that past strategies have become obsolete. Nonetheless, IT leaders are hopeful, with 91% saying they trust their employees to follow security best practice while out of the office. Unfortunately, this trust isn't necessarily deserved, with almost half of employees saying they're less likely to follow safe data practices when working from home. So really, we've got to look at the why. What are the driving factors that make people less likely to follow safe data practices? Employees cited not working on their usual devices being distracted as 2 of the top 3 reasons. Most of us can relate. When working remotely, especially from home, people have other responsibilities or distractions like childcare, roommates, and more often than not, they don't have dedicated workstations like they do in the normal office environment. This isn't trivial. But what's most striking is the fact that 48% of employees also count not being closely monitored by IT teams as a reason to ignore safe data practices. A particularly alarming fact in today's working world, where remote working is going nowhere anytime soon. When you combine this disparity in trust versus behavior with what we already know about human error, it's clear how crucial a time this is to assess current DLP solutions. A lot of you are probably thinking about leveraging training to combat that issue. But our research found that more training doesn't necessarily equate to fewer security incidents. Security awareness training doesn't appear to be curbing the problem of data loss. In fact, the percentage of employees who admit sending emails to the wrong person is actually the highest in organizations that provide security awareness training the most frequently. And highly regulated industries like financial services and healthcare, where training is more frequent, are the industries most likely to exfiltrate data by downloading, saving, or sending work-related documents to personal accounts before leaving a job. So you might be wondering, is this because training is more focused on inbound threats like phishing than outbound threats like data exfiltration? Or because employees don't consider things like accidentally sending an email to the wrong person as a data loss incident? Or is it because you can't train away people's propensity to make mistakes or break the rules? Whatever it is, training alone isn't solving the problem of human error on email. So what are all the consequences of this? Everyone watching knows that a breach is bad news for all of those involved, including employees, the organization, and any third parties like customers, suppliers, or patients. But employees and IT leaders aren't aligned on what they consider the biggest consequences to be, which could be increasing the risk of underreporting and data mishandling. This chart shows that employees count damaged reputation and losing their job as the top consequences, while IT leaders maintain that losing customers and all their trust and lost data are the biggest implications. So if you've got an employee base who are worried about what might happen to their job security after they're involved in a data incident, are they really going to be more comfortable following reporting practices? This may explain why most employees may never report mistakes related to data mishandling. And this misalignment has serious implications for DLP strategies too. The data tells us that IT leaders actually underestimate the number of incidents in their organization. So have a think. In your own organization, how many emails do you estimate are sent to the wrong person every year? IT leaders working at organizations with over 1,000 people in the US estimate up 480 emails are sent to the wrong person every year. On the other hand, according to Tessian data, an average of 800 emails are misdirected in organizations with 1,000 employees during a single year. This means that at least 1.6 times more misdirected emails are sent than IT leaders expect, many of which will contain structured and unstructured data in either the body copy, as attachments, or both. And emails sent to personal accounts are a much bigger problem than most realize too. While IT leaders estimate that just 720 unauthorized emails are sent each year in organizations with over 1,000 employees, according to Tessian data, an average of 27,500 unauthorized emails are sent each year in an organization with over 1,000 employees. That's 38 times more than estimated. Let that sink in for a moment. So while IT leaders create and implement security policies and procedures with the best intentions to stop these data loss incidents, they aren't always effective or well received. We found that over half of the employees say that security tools and software impede their productivity at work, and over half, again, say that they'll find a workaround if security software or policies make it difficult or prevent them from doing their job. It's only natural. Your employees are inclined to seek out the easiest or most convenient path to getting their jobs done, so it's easy to see the limitations of policies. So beyond policies, what are other popular options? A lot of IT leaders turn to rule-based technology. The problem is that most rule-based DLP solutions, whether integrated DLP or enterprise DLP, have limitations. And that's because you can't define and predict human behavior with rules. Even if you could, the time and resources required to create rules, update rules, and analyze data captured by those rules would be more than any IT team could manage. And as you see from this chart, 85% of IT leaders agree that rule-based DLP is admin intensive. Let's take an example. If an organization wanted to prevent employees from sending emails to their personal email accounts, they could create the following rule. If the recipient is an @gmail.com domain, then block the email. But this rule would block an unnecessary amount of benign communications with @gmail.com accounts that aren't personal. For example, could be freelancers, applicants, or employees at small firms. And when you consider all the possible examples of data loss, from bad leavers purposefully exfiltrating data to distracted employees misdirecting an email, you'd have to create custom policies for every single user in order to genuinely prevent data loss. That's unfeasible. So when training and policies ultimately fall short, IT leaders must look to new technology. And this is where the power of machine learning plays a game-changing role. So how does next generation DLP solve for these limitations? Security leaders are increasingly turning to machine learning. It takes a village to prevent data loss, and while security awareness training, up-to-date policies and procedures, and some rule-based technologies may have a place in security frameworks, they alone aren't the answer to DLP. Machine learning-based protections are a step in the right direction towards true DLP, though. In fact, 1 in 5 security leaders deem machine learning and intelligent automation the most effective way to prevent data loss. Tessian's own DLP solutions are powered by machine learning technology that are deployed to customers across industries from SMBs to multinational enterprises and are detecting and preventing millions of inbound and outbound threats on email. But it's not just our customers who are talking about the power of machine learning. According to a new report from 451 Research, the DLP market is ripe for change, and Tessian could be the next generation solution organizations need to secure their data. So how does Tessian prevent data loss? Your email data is an invaluable source of threat intelligence. Tessian turns that data into your best defense against inbound and outbound email security threats. There's a wealth of information behind each and every email communication employees send and receive. By harnessing the power of this data through machine learning, our human layer security technology understands human behavior and relationships, enabling Tessian Enforcer to automatically detect and prevent data exfiltration attempts, and Tessian Guardian to automatically detect and prevent misdirected emails. Importantly, Tessian's technology automatically updates its understanding of human behavior and involving relationships by continuous analysis and learning of the organization's email network without any rules required. Instead of expecting people to do the right thing 100% of the time, we think it's better to preempt these errors by detecting and preventing them from happening in the first place. That way, IT leaders can proactively stop sensitive information from leaving their environment, company IP stays secure, compliance standards are met, and customer trust is maintained. But we also think that it's important to enable and empower employees to do their best work and reduce the investigative burden on IT teams. Tessian does all of the above. Without inhibiting employee productivity or putting extra pressure on IT teams, machine learning algorithms trained on millions of your own historical email data points can understand normal patterns of employee behavior and accurately and automatically predict when they're making a mistake or breaking the rules. What's more, Tessian offers protection on both desktop and mobile devices, meaning your employees are protected wherever and however they work. So thank you very much for joining me today. I really hope you found this session valuable and you're ready to think differently about how data loss prevention tools are working for you. For access to the full data and research findings, please head to tessian.com/research. Next, I'll be diving deeper into some of these topics with our guests, 451 Research and Stefan Casriel, the former CEO of Upwork. So please stay tuned. Thank you. Thank you, Kelly, for the introduction, and hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining this next session. For those of you who have just joined and missed my earlier introduction, I'm Tim Sadler, and I'm the CEO and co-founder of Tessian, and I'll be your host for this session. So I'm delighted to be joined today by Principal Analyst in Information Security at 451 Research, Garrett Becker. Garrett has viewed enterprise security from a variety of vantage points over the past 16 years, including holding various analyst and research roles. He focuses on all things data security, which makes him well positioned to speak to us today about the impact distributed workforces and flexible working has had on information security, and specifically what we can do to minimize the risk of data loss. And again, as a quick reminder, you can submit questions for us through the Q&A widget at the side of the screen, and we'll get to those later on. So to kick off, at Tessian, we know people make mistakes, they break the rules, or they can be easily hacked. And our research shows that these behaviors are all more likely to happen when people are working remote. Garrett, what key strategies should IT leaders be aware of to address this heightened risk?
Yeah, thanks, Tim, and thanks everyone for joining us. I think a couple of things. The way we've been looking at the whole work from home thing is really looking at it in a matter of phases. And again, I think the very first phase is really about just survival, right? Just get everyone connected, get them up and running. A lot of firms that we've looked at have gone from anywhere from 5, 10, 15, 20% of their employees working remotely to over 95% in a matter of days, if not weeks. So for a lot of those firms, it's just a matter of getting them hooked up on their VPNs if they're using that for remote access or virtual desktop infrastructure, or even some of the newer zero trust based things. That also typically required, in many cases, just simple stuff like issuing laptops for people who didn't have them. So the first phase, I think, was all about just getting up and running, and I also think that that meant that some of the security steps were um, very basic up front. And I think now we've basically moved into phase two, and that's where all that initial infrastructure is in place. And now firms, I think, have a better chance of thinking about, okay, what are some of the risks that we have to be worried about? I think, as your data pointed out, I think was pretty stunning in the sense that there's a huge disconnect between what employers think their people are doing and what people are actually doing and what they think they can get away with. And I think it's important to distinguish between this can be both malicious and non-malicious, right? It can be as simple as users trying to do things either because they're lazy or they're just under the gun. They're just trying to get their jobs done as best they can. So they're doing things like taking corporate documents and emailing it to their Gmail account or their Yahoo Mail account and what have you. Or they're saving things in Box and Dropbox. Now, that may not be a problem. It may be a problem. But traditionally, those are things that standard DLP tools may find difficult to discover. But certainly, I think that's a risk that I think most firms have to deal with. I think some of the other issues we have to worry about is, as I said before, phishing. From what I can see, at least anecdotally, we've seen a massive increase in phishing related directly to COVID-19. That's a huge issue. It's also introducing the potential for ransomware. Ransomware is a really big problem right now. So again, to the extent that your employees are doing things like potentially not backing up their machines, you can run into some real serious problems.
Thanks for that, Garrett. And the research that you mentioned, so the DLP research Tessian conducted recently found that 48% of employees say they're less likely to follow safe data practices from working from home. Is there a place for automation and machine learning to help businesses review and investigate around the clock?
Yeah, I think so. And again, that data to me is just striking. And I think it really shows the big divide we're at in terms of, IT's perception of what their users are doing on the one hand, and then looking what they're actually doing and how they the way they think they can get away with things that they can't in the office, I find is very interesting. I think sending data to unauthorized accounts is obviously a common problem. People are potentially sending sensitive documents. For example, it might be as simple as, hey, I want to use it on a different machine that maybe has a bigger screen, or I like the keyboard better. And again, they're all trying to think of ways to get their jobs done. It reminds me a little bit of a problem when I first started at 451 6.5 years ago, the whole shadow IT problem, right? And that gave spawn to this whole industry in cloud security known as CASB, or Cloud Access Security Broker. And what the essential problem there was that people were downloading unsanctioned applications, signing up for applications without IT's control. And in some cases, that wasn't a problem, but really it introduced a new element of risk that IT wasn't prepared to deal with. And to some extent, with email, we're seeing the same thing. It may be the users don't have any bad intent, and it may be they're just looking for a way to get their job done. But it becomes a real problem in terms of security. And I think this is an area where traditional DLP tools have really fallen short, right? The typical things based on either regular expression searches or pattern matching, things like that. Those are typically good for catching social security numbers, credit cards, things that might be flagged for some sort of a compliance violation, whether it be GDPR or HIPAA. But I think more subtle things, again, like saving data up to Box or Dropbox, or emailing things to a personal account, all those things that we're likely to see increasingly in a work from home scenario. I think traditional DLP has not been great at finding. And I think that's really an area where things like artificial intelligence and machine learning, even to some extent, I've seen new technologies like natural language processing, natural language understanding, really help uncover behavior that's been difficult to capture before. Things that have that are very subtle and have a certain nuance that really requires building, I'd say, a lot of context around to determine what's normal and quote unquote what's normal and what's not normal.
Yeah, you preempted one of my next questions actually there, Garrett. So
Sorry,
the other thing that our research, revealed was that data loss incidents on email are happening as much as 38 times more often than IT leaders currently estimate. How important is it to have the right insight into threats and user trends to actually close this alarming disconnect? And this is something I know you've just spoken about as well, but how do we actually get to that promised land where IT and the employees are both in sync with one another?
Yeah, no, that's a great point, and I think again it goes back to this is I think it's not an easy problem to solve without some sort of context for what normal and what abnormal or unusual behavior is. Again, that traditional pattern matching can't find. A single action can be interpreted multiple ways. It may be fairly benign. It may be something that's, again, somebody wants to use a different device. It may be a legitimate user with a legitimate purpose, but it may also involve data that may be sensitive. So that in itself may potentially create a problem if that data were to be exposed. In an extreme case, it could be a disgruntled employee looking to cause damage. It could be one of your top salespeople about to go to a competitor and look to take all their client lists and things like that with them. So I think to be able to distinguish between these is a real problem in an area where traditional DLP tools, I think, have historically struggled. I think the other thing to keep in mind too is the data that we see repeatedly is that, and in fact, our own internal data, we've got a service called the Voice of the Enterprise where we survey enterprise end users, and repeatedly we pop up that email is still probably the number one threat vector of all. And that's despite, we've got all new things like all the new communication and collaboration platforms that are out there. It's still good old email that causes a lot of our problems because it's still widely in use and certainly an easy way to attack folks. So yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a really, really good point. And that's exactly how we think about it. The fact that email is default open by nature makes it such a security risk, certainly from a phishing and impersonation attack standpoint. And I know that this is a topic that's close to your heart as well. You talk, and we've previously spoken about the importance of how effective UAT or user acceptance testing is for helping with phishing and email risks.
Yeah, I think.
Sorry, I guess I didn't maybe point that correctly as a question, Garrett. But I guess what are your thoughts around UAT, or like, could you share some more thoughts on why you think UAT is or isn't so effective in that?
Yeah, I think a little bit. I don't know, maybe mixed view of it. I think it can be a valuable tool in the right context, right? I think there's certainly no harm in educating your employees about certain things they shouldn't do. That's never a bad thing, right? And I think even as security professionals, we could stand reminders from time to time on the things we shouldn't do. I think there are a couple of drawbacks, however, and I think my ultimate view is that user awareness training is fine, but it's not. It's maybe arguably you could say in a mathematical terms it's necessary, but not sufficient. And I think it needs to be used in conjunction with other tools. One of the problems I think overall with security is that in a lot of ways end users really don't face any consequences, right? They're not accountable for a lot of issues. So if they do something wrong, they're not necessarily reprimanded for it, which I think is a whole other set of questions. But I also think phishing attacks have become so effective and so targeted and so really almost impossible to distinguish. You can really catch anyone, and I think it becomes that point where no amount of awareness training in the world is really going to help. it's really unrealistic to think that certain of these attacks, some of the ones I've seen recently, are just really, really hard for to put the burden on end users to do that. I also think, me personally, I'm very aware of the limitations of putting a huge burden on your end users for a lot of your security posture. And again, it ties back in some degree to the accountability issue. But I also think it's a little bit unrealistic. But I also think it puts a big burden on your end users. And what I found is they don't like it, and if people don't like it, they're going to do whatever they can to get around it, and they're going to click on anything or classify anything in whatever they have to do to get that email out the door and make the tool go away and allow them to do their job. So those are some of the issues that I see. Again, to be clear, I think there is value, to doing user awareness training, but I also think it's got its limitations, and I think it best used as a complement with other solutions.
Yeah, no, I think that makes complete sense, and I share that view as well. It's very, very difficult, certainly when you're in that game of trying to train people for potentially infinite scenarios that could play out with regard to impersonation. But it is still, nonetheless, awareness training is important, and it's an important part of a security strategy. Switching gears slightly, remote work has accelerated a trend that was, some will say on its way anyway. Where are we going next? What do you think is on the agenda for IT leaders after this?
Yeah, again, great question, and one that we're basically living with day to day. Again, we've been looking at phases. Phase one was about getting everyone up and running and just getting everything working. And then phase two is, I think, about, okay, now how do we go think about securing this environment? And I think what we're also getting into right now is, okay, where do we go from here? We've already seen, at least here in the United States, depending on where you live, schools are starting to think about reopening. Certain businesses that we're aware of are starting to lay down their plans about returning to the office, what that could look like, et cetera. Certainly, that'll have implications for the office environment, and in turn, how security is done. But I also think it's very interesting what is the permanence of the whole work from home thing. So our pre-COVID data showed that roughly just over 1/4 of all enterprises had employees worked from home at least some or part of their week. Now we've seen a big increase in that, obviously. But what I think was most interesting, our most recent published survey on this, we asked what are the common ways to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic, and obviously, I think the number one reason was restricting travel and no longer going to meetings. And number three was work from home. But interestingly, 38% of respondents said that they thought work from home strategies are actually going to be permanent. Now, you may have heard there's been firms in the news such as Facebook, have talked about making work from home permanent. Others have said they plan to extend it for the rest of the year. We did a more recent survey, and I'm not allowed to release the details yet because it hasn't been published, but I can say that number of firms who see work from home as being permanent has actually increased quite sharply above 38%. So I think that is certainly something that's going to happen. And with that, I think we're going to see an acceleration of other trends. I think we could see a boost for more cloud migration. We could see, I think, more widespread adoption of SaaS applications and accelerating what we'd previously been in place. I also think we're going to see an increase in this whole zero trust phenomenon that has gotten traction in the past year or so, which basically the essential idea is it does away with the old security paradigm, which is based on this notion of a hardened perimeter and everyone on the inside is trusted and everyone on the outside is untrusted. That has been eroded considerably with the rise of mobility and cloud computing, and the fact that workers are no longer at home, they're traveling, what have you. I think work from home just accelerates that and moves us more towards that zero trust phenomenon. And again, what are all the security implications that entails along with it? I think that leads to increased adoption of multi-factor authentication, access control strategies, and on the data side, I think you're going to see a lot more use of encryption. You'll see a lot more use of data security in general to make sure not only your users but also your data is locked down in those environments. Because as your data has pointed out, um, there's less control on the perimeter than there used to be, and at the endpoint. So we need to take a lot more steps to do that, and that includes DLP, that includes potentially data discovery, that includes protection against phishing and anti-malware, et cetera. So.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. We're now going to move to some questions from our audience. So I'm just picking up one here. It sounds like there's a bigger role for the DLP at the moment. Are boards viewing security priorities or spending in security differently because of the pandemic?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, the short answer is yes, and I think it's because they have to. I don't think they've got really much choice in the matter. Again, going back to the early question, I think a lot of firms went through the fire drill of setting up work from home and dropping everything they were doing. I heard anecdotally talking to some CISOs that any project that required intensive resources or any planning and long-term commitments was sort of kicked to the side while work from home was put in place. And I think potentially now that's up and running, some of those, there may be some time to come back to some of those projects. One example would be something like privileged account management. Some IAM projects tend to be fairly resource intensive. I also think this could give a boost to security offerings that are not heavy touch or require a lot of resources, things that may be cloud-based, things that may be API-based that have a fairly quick time to deployment. I think could get a boost in this requirement. But I also think we're also seeing too is firms are, not surprisingly, overall, security firms are increasing their spending plans on security pretty steadily. We had done a couple of, I guess you'd call flash surveys throughout the COVID pandemic, and we've seen pretty consistently the expectations for security spending overall to rise. Now, I think that could potentially accelerate, but we're also, as I mentioned earlier, let me step back a bit. I think the one difference there and one challenge is that it may not necessarily be the same for all firms, right? While some firms may be able to increase their spending, I think it's reasonable to presume that will depend to some extent on what industry vertical you're in. Obviously, in some areas of IT have fared reasonably well throughout this, for example, but if you're potentially in travel and leisure or hotels and lodging or energy, certain other sectors of our economy haven't fared so well. But I also think, again, getting back to this idea that we may see more digital transformation initiatives and these plans for cloud migration increase going forward. I think that's also going to put some more emphasis on securing data overall. In fact, our survey data has shown consistently over the last several years that the number one pain point and the number one priority for most of the CISOs and enterprises that we talk to by far is cloud security. And even within that, when we look, some of the questions we ask around cloud security points to DLP as being a top use case. So I think those are definitely some things to ponder as we go forward in this environment.
That's great. Thank you, Garrett. So I'm afraid that's all we have time for, but thank you to all of those who submitted questions. For those that we didn't manage to cover, we'll be sure to follow up with you individually to continue the conversation. I want to say a huge thank you to Garrett for joining us today and sharing your wealth of knowledge with us in this space. And thank you to our audience for joining this session. I'll be handing back over to Kelly, so please stay tuned.
And finally, we're welcoming Stefan to the virtual stage. Stefan is the former CEO of Upwork, is a future of work visionary, and is an expert on how to successfully build flexible and distributed teams. He'll be sharing some of his personal experiences and insight with Tim in our final session.
Thank you, Kelly, for the introduction, and hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining this session. For those of you who've just joined and missed my earlier introduction, I'm Tim Sadler. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Tessian, and I'll be your host for this session. For those of you less familiar with us, Tessian builds technology to empower people to work safely without security getting in their way. And Tessian's human layer security platform automatically protects your employees on email from risks like data exfiltration, accidental data loss, and phishing. So I'm delighted to be joined today by Stefan Casriel. Stefan is the former CEO of Upwork and a future of work visionary. Distributed workforces is part of Upwork's DNA, which makes him an expert on the future of work and the rise of flexible remote teams. And that's exactly what I'm here to talk to him about today. And we want to make sure this session is as valuable as possible for our audience. So I want to remind you that you can submit questions for us through the Q&A widget at the side of the screen. So to kick off, Stefan, can you tell us a bit more about how distributed working was built into Upwork's DNA?
Yeah, there's an expression here. So first of all, thank you for having me, Tim. This is fantastic. But one of the expressions that people use in the Bay Area is eating your own dog food. And so Upwork is a website and a mobile app that helps people work from home and helps companies engage with people that work from home. And so we decided from day one that we couldn't convince our customers to do this if we didn't do it ourselves. And so Upwork today is about 2,000 people. There's about 300 of them who work in an office, 2 offices in the Bay Area, 1 in Chicago. But the vast majority of people are working from home. I think we have people in something like 500 different cities in the world. And some of them have been working with the company for a decade or longer. So this is not just short-term gigs for low-value work. A lot of this is core software development, legal services, financial services for the company, just people that are not physically present in the office.
500 offices, that is a huge achievement to have that kind of scale of remote workforce. What have you actually learned along the way about making remote work a success with your team?
Yeah, there's a lot of different learnings. I would say increasingly people have documented those learnings. So Upwork has an entire website and it's been updated for the pandemic. Obviously to state the obvious, there's a lot more people that are working from home right now than ever in the past, many of whom were not prepared for this and their companies were not prepared for this. So Upwork has published a pretty meaningful set of recommendations, but it's not the only company that has done it. GitLab has an amazing set of documents, Zapier, Buffer, Trello, which is part of Atlassian. There's probably half a dozen different companies that have done remote at scale, Automatic, the people behind WordPress, or the people behind Basecamp. So I would say at the very highest level, I would just say treat people the way you want to be treated, right? Like put yourself in the shoes of one of your people working from home, particularly in a time like today where this is not normal remote work. This is remote work where people may be sick, people may be scared of being sick, they may have people close to them that are sick, they may have children at home, they may have multiple people on Zoom at any point in time and not enough bandwidth to connect. And so I would say rule number 1 is empathy. Realize that this is a tough time for everybody and leading with care and love is probably one of the best things you can do. The second one, which is probably pretty obvious, is if you manage people in different time zones, realize that they have different working hours from you. So switch from a very synchronous model where everybody's on Zoom all day long or everybody's meeting at the same time to something that's more asynchronous where you do more writing or you do more things on Loom, which is kind of the offline version of Zoom, if you will. And I would say that the third thing is just realize that you need to communicate even more when people are distributed than when they're local. So, repeat yourself, set up meetings when meetings need to be set up, document more than you would otherwise. Don't assume that everybody knows what's in your head, because that's really not true even when they're working close to you, but it's even harder for them to get into your head if they're remote. And there's a long list beyond that, but I would say those are like the high level ones.
Yeah, and I love that point about leading with empathy. I think it's so, so important during this time. And obviously these are, we're seeing the kind of the key takeaways from years and years of trial and error. What have been some of the lessons learned along the way? And, you've outlined some really important practices here for companies who are just getting to grips with this new normal. But it'd be really interesting to understand, what hasn't worked out in the way that you thought it might have, and what approach would you encourage companies to take so that they can have a continual cycle of learning with how they're improving their remote work initiative?
Yeah, and I think that's the key, right? Is a continuous cycle of learning, get feedback on what's working and not, document the best practices, share them through the organization, especially if you're a bigger company. There might be part of your organization that's doing it really well and other parts of their organization not so much. And sharing best practices is absolutely essential. But I would say there's probably two things. One is learn about time zones. If people are in multiple different countries, work-life balance matters, and expecting somebody to be always awake from 2 a.m. to 5 a.m. because that's what you need, unless that's truly what they were signing up for initially, is probably not a good idea. So when we assemble teams within Upwork, we were always cognizant of having people on potentially 2 different time zones that were compatible with each other, but rarely on 3. So for instance, US plus Asia plus Europe, somebody does not sleep, right? So that's one component of it. The second one, which actually is what companies are being forced to do right now, so that's helpful, is when you're switching from a very local model to a very distributed model, the easiest way to do it is not to hire a bunch of people from the outside that are working remotely, but instead to allow your current employees, especially the people that are the most tenured, that really know everybody, know how to get things done. When they give you feedback, you're going to listen to the feedback, let them work remotely. And by the way, that doesn't just mean working from home in San Francisco. That means if they choose to relocate to another part of the country, let them do that. In fact, encourage them to do it. We at Upwork, we have a relocation package. We actually call it the delocation package, which is if you're based in San Francisco and you want to move to another part of the country, we'll actually pay for your moving expenses. And the idea there is it's hard enough if you're not a remote first company, it's hard enough for your existing employees to work remotely. It's even harder for new people to come in and work remotely. And so the challenge with a lot of companies is they try to go from one extreme, which is everybody's in the same office, to the other where you hire a bunch of new people who know nothing about the company and don't know anybody, and have them be successful. And I think the intermediate plan is take your existing people, allow them to work from home. So check, this is happening right now. Step 2 is allow your existing people to relocate to another part of the country if they choose to. And then step 3, start to open up hiring, probably first in places where you have local employees already, because you're going to have that, face-to-face connection from time to time, which is really helpful to build a sense of community.
And this leads me on nicely, I think, that the delocation pack, I like that terminology. And there are a lot of people who are, I think, rethinking where they have to be based in terms of their location to actually now work for the companies they do. You describe flexible working as a win-win scenario, I guess, for employees and also for the employer. Could you maybe unpack that a little bit and just share a bit more of your thinking around that with us?
Yeah, and I would say there's even a third component, which is society as a whole, right? So why is it a good thing for employers? Well, the main downside, which is the myth, is people are going to be working less. It's bad for your culture. You're going to have retention issues, all that stuff. None of which is true, right? In companies that are good at measuring worker productivity, and most of them are not, there is no data that shows that worker productivity goes down when people are working remotely. In fact, there's tons of data that shows the opposite. The idea that it's bad for retention, like employee loyalty, I can give you the example of Upwork. The people that work remotely stay at the company at least twice as long as the people that are based in San Francisco. And it's pretty obvious why. If you're based in San Francisco, you've got all the other tech companies that are trying to poach you all the time. When you live in the middle of Sacramento or Stockton or Modesto or even outside of California, there's a lot less competition for talent, right? So good for companies. Employee retention obviously cost. Like the cost of living in San Francisco is so high that you can find equally talented talent for significantly less money elsewhere, right? So that's the company point. And I would say more than cost savings, for the most part, it's about attraction of talent and retention of the talent. On the employee side, like I think we've done many surveys over the years at Upwork, and most people would prefer to have more flexibility in their life and to be able to potentially relocate to another part of the country. The San Jose Mercury News does a study every year, and they just updated it and went up again. But last year, more than 50% of the tech employees who live in the Bay Area said that they would choose to leave the Bay Area if they could keep the same job and the same pay, right? And so there's a meaningful number of people who live in places like New York and London and San Francisco and Shanghai, not because they really enjoy the lifestyle or the cost of living, but because that's where the jobs are, right? So that's how it helps people. But secondly, it also helps people that are excluded from the current workforce to participate in the workforce. So one of the studies that Upwork does every year called Freelancing in America, we ask freelancers, would you ever choose to work for a regular employer? And 50% of freelancers say no. And when you ask them why, usually the answers are care duties, a physical or mental disability that makes it hard for them to contribute to a regular office environment, or living in a part of the country where there's no job. So you're really allowing lots and lots of people who otherwise can't get access to great jobs like yours to have access to them. And then the third piece is society as a whole. So one thing that's pretty well documented by economists is if you have a highly paid worker move to a part of the country that is economically challenged, it creates on average an extra 4 jobs. And it's pretty obvious why, right? You put a highly paid software developer in the middle of the country, and they're going to start to consume goods and services, which further creates more jobs and restarts the new economy, as opposed to today. I mean, if you look at the situation here in San Francisco today, almost all of the people whose jobs truly require them to be in San Francisco can't afford to live anywhere nearby. And meanwhile, the people whose jobs can be done from anywhere all live in San Francisco. So it's kind of the opposite of where it needs to be. And I think this distributed work approach can really be a win-win-win for society, for the workers, and for the employers as well.
Yeah. There's some fascinating stats there as well. I'd seen a few of those recently. It does, it seems obvious when you say it that there are so many other benefits that come from this kind of setup. And I guess though, from the company's perspective, it's really, really important that you're empowering your workforce and your employees to be successful in this environment. And there are certain things when you're running a company that you still have to get right, whether you're a remote work environment or whether you are in physical offices around the world. Obviously, a topic very close to our heart is security and thinking about how you keep people secure with the data they're handling, whether they're working from their home office or their front room. It'd be curious to understand your perspective, some of the things that you've done to empower your workforce overall from a technology perspective, and then when it comes to actually security specifically, what do you think companies need to have in mind?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's definitely several components to allowing a distributed workforce to be successful. There are human resources related matters. There are legal related matters, right? Employment is regulated in just about every country, so you need to understand what you're getting yourself into. Usually there's tax and accounting implications. If you have nexus in multiple states in the US, let alone if you have people in multiple countries and you employ them directly, this might create financial, tax, and accounting matters that you need to resolve. And then to your point, there's huge security considerations that you need to take into account. And I would say, like in the case of Upwork specifically, there's 2 different natures of the issue, if you will. One is bring your own device, right? Most of the people on Upwork are freelancers. We don't send them a laptop. We don't send them an iPhone. We don't control their environment. But then they get access to secure environment of the Upwork infrastructure, right? So securing a bring your own device type of environment, absolutely critical. The second one is we don't know where they are. When everybody's in the office, you know that you don't have people spying on them from the behind them on Starbucks. When they're somewhere else in the world, you can't assume that, right? So you need to design systems and policies to make sure that the intellectual property of the company and the security of the company is not compromised. So to give you one example, very early on at Upwork, we decided that anything that needs to be secure should be behind the VPN, irrespective of whether you're working from home or working from the office, right? And so we've really, from day one, said location should not matter. There's nothing magical about the office. We should always assume that you are in a non-trusted environment and make sure that we build systems to accommodate for that.
Yeah, and this also comes down to the point as well, I imagine, of the culture that you create as a remote work company. And we're used to building culture, or certainly as a CEO, I've been used to building culture when you have people in the office, you can get people together, you can do socials together, those kinds of things. What are some of the tips that you have for organizations who are thinking about how you actually create a really, really amazing culture as a remote company, and having to consider all of these other things like the practices, and you ran through some of them: HR, legal, security?
Yeah. Well, I would say, other than right now where everybody's stuck at home and really can't meet face to face, in general, I think most remote first companies tend to do lots and lots of face to face meetings. At Upwork, we had a meaningful travel budget where we would do meetups. So not 2,000 people in the same place, which doesn't work for most people, but we would give agile teams a small budget every year so that they could meet up in a cool city. And every time we'd have meetings in Budapest and Madrid and Chile and where have you. And it's a great perk for people. And for a couple of weeks, they would be in an Airbnb and they'd be coding during the day, and they'd be socializing in the evenings and weekends. And people tend to really like that, right? And so face-to-face does matter. I think we're going to go from a world where we organize off-sites to a world where we organize on-sites, if you will. But this, is really true. Like, there is a social connection at work that is hard to do over Zoom, and regularly you need to update it by having face-to-face meetings. Now, that's not really possible right now, but I would say the second part to your answer is culture is bigger than just free coffee in the office or ping pong table or what have you. Culture is a set of values and a shared purpose. And one thing that's amazing about people everywhere in the world, or at least everywhere in the US, is you're widening the talent pool so much that you can find people that are really passionate about what you do. And so as a result, you can find people who really live the values, live the purpose of the company. They're here because they truly believe in the mission of what you're trying to do. And that, to me, is really what culture is about.
Yeah, it's so important. I couldn't agree more. And I think as well, for many companies, it's also a good thing that they're being stretched and they're being challenged to think deeper than just some of the kind of superficial, skin deep perks maybe that otherwise would have substituted something that is altogether so much more important for companies. And I have to ask you that we've spoken a lot about remote work. This is something you've been practicing for a long time now. What is your thesis? What's your opinion on the future of work? And I guess I'm specifically interested as well. This change, I guess, nobody saw coming, and this way that we've been accelerated to remote working. What do you think it means for the next 5 years in terms of companies and technology, but also outside of our sector?
I think it just accelerated the future by a decade. A sobering fact is, I think the virus has done more in 3 months than I've been able to do in 10 years. But we've really gone into the future in a really big way. And I think what really matters here is to understand what's not working and fix it quickly. There are plenty of things that you can do wrong. This is the time where we can improve diversity, we can improve inclusion, and we can improve efficiency and have more efficient companies. And so I think it's really important for companies to poll their managers, to poll their employees, and to figure out, very quickly, like, what are we not doing well, and to optimize for it, because that train has left the station and it's moving fast right now.
Yeah. So you think that I guess this change will show companies a way of working that means that, whether they like it or not, we're not going back to the way things were. This is something that's here to stay. And whether we go to hybrid environments or fully remote environments, we now have to adapt to this new way of working.
Yeah, I mean, I doubt that every company is going to be fully distributed anytime soon, right? I mean, there's definitely going to be a hybrid model, which is one thing that companies need to figure out, is how you become inclusive of the remote workforce when there's a lot of people still in the office. But I think there's a lot of misconceptions companies had about remote work that are being disproved right now. Now, to be fair, I think there's also a concern right now that because people are working from home in conditions that are not ideal, as I said earlier, people that are sick and people that have kids that are, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, I think some companies might come to the wrong conclusion, which is, wow, this was a real failed experiment. We can't wait to have everybody back in the office. But the reality, though, is the workforce has moved on. So if you as an employer, you think you can go back to the old ways, you're going to lose a lot of your team members because they're not moving back. In fact, the place they're moving to might be outside of where they live right now, in a place where they can have a much better lifestyle.
Yeah, no, I agree. I completely agree. We're now going to move to some audience Q&A. So we will pause those questions there and we'll move to some questions from the audience. And the question is, regardless of what happens after COVID, should businesses adopt a remote or flexible structure, in your opinion, Stefan?
Yeah, I think people have to. Frankly, I think the workforce is going to be voting with their feet. If you don't allow people to work more flexibly post-COVID, there's a lot of employers who will, and they'll attract the best talent.
That's a really interesting way of looking at it, which actually it's the overall market for employment, and flexibility, as you say, as soon as it's there with one set of employers, it's going to become something that people prioritize. So I'm afraid that's all we have time for, but thank you to all of those who submitted questions. For those who didn't manage to cover, we'll be sure to follow up with you individually to continue the conversation. I want to say a huge thank you to Stefan for sharing his time with us today. I'm sure in some form of another, remote working is here to stay. So this has been an invaluable discussion for us. Thank you so much for being with us. And thank you to our audience also for joining our session. I'll be handing back over to Kelly, so please stay tuned.
Thank you, Tim and Stefan, for rounding up the day, and thank you to the rest of our speakers for sharing such powerful insights with us. We have covered a lot today, but I think the three most important things to take away are: 1, adopt a people-first approach to security. Whether it's adjusting security messaging, modifying policies, or understanding and tracking employee behavior, security must be designed for your people. Number 2, strengthen your defense tactics against phishing attacks. We heard from Bobby at Unilever. When people are at home, their guards will be down, which means the attack surface goes up, and successful attacks are more likely. Bad actors are already onto this. Number 3, make employee wellness and well-being a priority. As Elvis from the FBI said, even if we're at technology 5.0, we're still at human being 1.0. Looking after our people, making sure they're less stressed and fully supported, will help them focus and stay vigilant during this challenging time. So on behalf of everyone at Tessian, I want to thank you all for joining us for our virtual Human Layer Security Summit. I hope you gained a better understanding of how to protect your people, data, and systems, and more importantly, how to enable your employees and businesses to thrive while staying secure. And finally, this event would not be possible without the incredible planning and support of our events and production teams, our speakers, and our partners, HackerOne, Nord, SASIG, Women in Security and Privacy, Security Current, and Pivot Point Security. And of course, it wouldn't be possible without you, our community of security, IT, and compliance leaders. Our audience has been brilliant, helping us push the conversation forward with really thoughtful Q&A submissions. If you enjoyed watching today, head over to tessian.com/resources, where you'll find more research, content, and videos from our previous events. Thank you so much, stay safe, and take care.